Grant Mercer shoved the letter across the kitchen table so hard it slid off the edge and landed face down on the floor. "Send her back," he said. "I don't care what it costs." The ranch hand who'd driven the wagon from town stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, not saying anything. He'd seen plenty in his years working the Blackstone, but the look on Grant's face right now, that cold, dismissive curl of his upper lip, made even him uncomfortable. Abigail Holloway stood just inside the door, her travel bag at her feet, her coat still buttoned to the throat against the January cold. She had heard every word. She did not flinch. She had been hearing words like that her entire life, and she had learned, the hard way, that flinching only encouraged people to say more. "The advertisement said housekeeper," she said quietly. "I am a housekeeper." Grant turned to look at her then, really look at her. And the expression on his face was not anger. It was something worse. It was the look of a man who has already made up his mind and sees no reason to reconsider. "The advertisement," he said, "was written before my father got sick, before the pantry went empty, before this place needed someone who could actually work." He did not say what he meant directly. He never did, she would come to learn. But the meaning was plain enough in the way his eyes moved over her, top to bottom, one slow sweep, before he turned away like he'd already settled the matter. If you have ever walked into a room and been told, without a single word spoken, that you do not belong there, that your presence is an inconvenience, an embarrassment, a mistake, then you know exactly what Abigail Holloway felt in that moment. And if you have ever stayed anyway, you know what kind of person she was. Before we go any further, if this story is already pulling at something in you, I want you to hit that subscribe button and the like button right now. Every week I bring you stories like this one, stories about people who got counted out and refused to stay down. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Blackstone Ranch, because things are about to get a great deal worse before they get better. The Blackstone Ranch sat 12 miles from the nearest town, which in January, in Wyoming territory, might as well have been 100. The road in was frozen solid and the wind came off the high plains without anything to stop it, cutting through wool coats and canvas jackets like they were made of paper. The ranch house itself was solid enough, 2 stories, stone foundation, a fireplace in nearly every room. But solid was not the same as warm, and warm was not the same as alive. And the Blackstone, in that third week of January 1883, had very little life left in it. Silas Mercer had been sick for 11 days. The local physician, a man named Aldrin, who rode out from Carvel twice a week when the road permitted, had done what he could. He'd bled Silas twice, administered quinine for the fever, and left behind a bottle of something brown that smelled like turpentine and tasted, according to the one ranch hand who'd tried it, about the same. Nothing had worked. The fever had climbed, retreated slightly, climbed again, and now sat somewhere between dangerous and fatal, hovering there like it couldn't quite make up its mind. Silas Mercer was 61 years old. He had built the Blackstone from raw land with his own hands, had buried a wife and a son, had survived drought and cattle sickness, and a winter in 1878 that killed half the livestock in the territory. He was not a man who gave up easily. But fever didn't care about stubbornness. Grant Mercer was 33, the surviving son, and he ran the ranch now in everything but name. He was competent. Everyone who knew him agreed on that. And he had his father's practical intelligence and his mother's sharp tongue, and very little of either parent's capacity for patience. He had sent for a housekeeper because the regular cook, a woman named Darla, had left in November when her sister in Kansas fell ill, and nobody had thought to replace her before the weather closed in and everything went sideways. The advertisement had gone to 3 towns. Only one person had responded, Abigail Holloway, age 26, of Denver, Colorado. Grant had not thought much about the response when it arrived. A brief, careful letter written in a clean, educated hand, stating her experience and her willingness to travel. He had sent a reply offering the position and the dates of arrival, and that had been that. He had been thinking about his father, about the cattle, about the empty pantry and the coming storm, and he had not thought to ask about the woman herself. Now she was standing in his kitchen, and she was not what he'd expected. She was not what anyone expected. Abigail Holloway was a large woman, not tall, she stood barely 5'4", but broad through the shoulders and wide through the middle, carrying her weight the way some women do when life has been long and unkind, and food has been one of the few reliabilities. She was not pretty in the way the frontier valued pretty. No sharp angles, no delicate features. Her face was round, her hands were wide, and she moved with the slow deliberateness of someone who had learned to take up only the space she absolutely needed and no more. She was also, though Grant Mercer did not yet know this, one of the most capable people ever to walk through the door of the Blackstone Ranch. He did not know that yet. What he knew was that he'd been expecting someone capable of hard physical work, and what had arrived instead was a woman who, in his estimation, looked like she'd have trouble making it from the kitchen to the well and back. "I'm sorry," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "I don't think this is going to work out." "You haven't given it a chance," Abigail said. "I don't have time to give things chances. My father is upstairs dying." "Then let me go upstairs." Grant stared at her. "Let me see him," she said. "Before you put me back in that wagon and send me 12 miles back to town in the cold, let me look at the patient and look at the pantry. Give me an hour. If I haven't shown you something worth keeping me around for by then, I'll go without an argument." There was a long silence. Hector Vance, the ranch hand in the doorway, shifted his weight from one boot to the other. Somewhere upstairs something creaked, the house settling in the cold, or maybe Silas turning in his bed. Grant looked at Abigail for a long moment, then he looked away. "1 hour," he said, "and then you're gone." The upstairs hallway of the Blackstone Ranch house smelled like sickness and wood smoke and something else beneath both. The particular smell of a space where hope had quietly given up and left without saying goodbye. Abigail noticed it the moment she reached the top of the stairs. She didn't comment on it. She had smelled it before, in other houses, in other hard seasons, and she knew that comment on it only made things worse. Silas Mercer's room was at the end of the hall. The door was ajar. She knocked anyway. 2 firm knocks, the kind that didn't apologize for themselves, and pushed it open. The man in the bed was not what she'd expected from the force of his reputation. Grant had not told her much, but the ranch hands had talked freely enough on the ride from town, the way people do when they've been holding something in too long. Silas Mercer, they said, had once walked 15 miles through a blizzard to reach a neighbor's burning barn. Silas Mercer had stared down a hired gun in Carvel's one saloon and made the man back down without drawing. Silas Mercer was the kind of man who didn't bend. The man in the bed was bent nearly in half. He lay on his side, knees drawn up, the blankets twisted around him in the way of someone who has been fighting sleep and fever both for a long time and is losing on both fronts. His face, what she could see of it, was gray-white and sunken, the cheeks hollow, the eyes closed but not peacefully. His breathing was audible from the doorway, shallow and fast, with a wet catch at the bottom of each exhale that Abigail did not like at all. She crossed the room and stood beside the bed. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He didn't answer. She reached out and put her hand on his forehead, not the hesitant touch of someone uncertain about the intimacy of it, but the flat, practiced hand of someone who has done this before and knows what she's feeling for. The heat was significant, not the worst she'd ever felt, but not far from it. She looked at the bedside table, the brown bottle from the physician, a water glass, nearly empty, with a chalky residue at the bottom, the quinine, a cloth that had dried stiff in the cold air of the room. She picked up the cloth, folded it, and set it on the table. She refilled the glass from the pitcher by the window. The water was cold, nearly ice, and she made a mental note about that. She looked at the fireplace. The fire was low, burning down to coals, and nobody had banked it properly. She spent 3 minutes in that room before she went back downstairs. Grant was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, arms crossed, jaw set in the way of a man who has already written an outcome and is simply waiting for the story to catch up. "Well," he said. "His fever is high, but not terminal yet," she said. "His breathing concerns me more. There's fluid building. The quinine isn't working because you're not giving it with enough water and the room is too cold. The fire's been burning down at night and nobody's banking it, which means he's spending the cold hours fighting the temperature instead of fighting the sickness." Grant blinked. Dr. Aldrin comes twice a week and does what he can in the time he has," Abigail said. "I'd be here the other 5 days. That's a different thing." She paused. "Now show me the pantry." The pantry was worse than she'd expected, and she'd expected bad. It was a long, narrow room off the kitchen, shelved floor to ceiling on both sides, and those shelves were mostly empty in the way that suggested not just poverty, but neglect. The slow emptying of a household that has lost its organizing intelligence. There were gaps where staples should have been. Whoever had been managing the food supply through Darla's absence had been doing it badly, buying in fits and starts, letting things run out. What remained? 2 large bags of dried navy beans, a small tin of salt, a heel of salt pork, about 3 pounds, wrapped in cloth and showing its age, a jar of dried sage, a smaller jar of something brown and unlabeled that she opened and sniffed, dried thyme mostly, with something else underneath, maybe rosemary, half a sack of cornmeal, a jug of apple cider vinegar, a box of dried chamomile flowers, dusty, shoved to the back of the top shelf, several onions, soft but not rotten, in a burlap bag on the floor. She stood in the pantry for a long time, turning over what was there in her mind, building something out of it. Grant appeared in the doorway behind her. "I told you, there's nothing to work with." "There's more than you think," she said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Those are emergency stores. They've been sitting there for years. The beans are probably hardened through. The pork is old." "Old doesn't mean useless," she said. "What are you planning to make? Poverty soup?" She turned and looked at him. "I'm planning to make a broth that will give your father something to fight with. His body is burning through everything it has trying to fight this fever. He needs nutrients, warmth, hydration. He's getting none of those things right now." She picked up the salt pork. "This will do. The beans will take time to rehydrate, but we have time if we start now." "You don't know what you're talking about." "My husband was a physician," she said. "He died 4 years ago. Before he died, I worked alongside him for 6 years. I have watched sick men pull through on less than this, and I have watched them die with better resources than this because the care was wrong." She set the salt pork down on the kitchen counter. "The care has been wrong here. I can fix that, but I need you to get out of my kitchen." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. Hector Vance, leaning against the back door with his coffee cup, made no sound at all. Grant's jaw worked. Something moved behind his eyes, something that might have been anger or might have been, at its core, the thing underneath anger that men like him don't usually let anyone see. "You have until morning," he said. "I only need tonight," she said, and she turned back to the pantry and started to work. It took her 40 minutes to sort through what was there and organize it into what she needed. The ranch hands came and went through the kitchen while she worked. 3 of them, Hector and 2 younger men named Dawes and Presley, and they watched her with the open, unguarded curiosity of men who haven't been around women much and aren't good at hiding their reactions. She could feel their eyes on her while she moved around the kitchen, could feel the thoughts behind those eyes, and she was long past the point of letting thoughts she couldn't hear wound her. What she could hear was Dawes, who was young enough to not know better, saying something low to Presley by the back door. She caught the word cook and the word eat, and something else she didn't quite catch, followed by a quickly muffled sound that might have been laughter. She kept working. She put the beans to soak in the largest pot she could find, covered with water from the well, set near the fire. They would need hours. She had hours. She cut the salt pork into rough chunks, not wasting any of it, saving even the rind. She quartered the onions and set them to brown in the iron skillet with a thin film of lard. Not much, just enough to coax out the sweetness, which would matter later for the flavor and mattered now for the warmth that a properly built broth always carries. While the onions browned, she thought, not about what people were saying about her sheets, she was done spending energy on that particular exercise. She thought about Silas Mercer upstairs, about the wet catch in his breathing, about the way his knees had been pulled up to his chest. She thought about what she'd seen in that room, what the signs told her, and she thought about the cases her husband Franklin had taught her to read, not through books, though there had been books, but through watching, through being present in the room with the sick person and paying attention to what most people didn't think to pay attention to. Franklin had said, more than once, the body tells you what it needs. Most people aren't listening. She had listened. For 6 years she had listened, and she had learned things that no medical school in the country taught to women, because medical schools in this country didn't teach to women. And Franklin had been both liberal-minded enough and practical enough to understand that the person beside him was more useful if she knew what she was doing. She pulled the dried chamomile from the shelf and rubbed a pinch between her fingers. It was old, but not dead. Good. The onions were ready. She added the salt pork and let everything hiss and spit together, browning the edges of the pork, building the base layer of the broth, the thing that would carry everything else. Hector Vance drifted close enough to see what she was doing and stood there for a moment without saying anything. "You worked for a doctor?" he said finally. "My husband," she said without looking up. "What happened to him?" "Typhoid, 1879. She turned the salt pork pieces. "He was treating patients for it. He was careful, but sometimes careful isn't enough." Hector was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," she said. And she meant it, and he could tell she meant it, and something in his posture shifted, some small private recalibration that she noticed and filed away. She was building more than a broth in that kitchen. She didn't know that yet, not fully. But the seeds of it were already there in Hector Vance's quiet apology and the silence that followed it. At some point, she did not know exactly when because she had stopped watching the clock and was watching the pot instead. The kitchen became hers. It happened the way most things happened, not all at once, but by small degrees. Dawes stopped lounging against the back door and started actually sitting at the table, elbows on his knees, watching her work with something that had moved past mockery into something more like attention. Presley, who had gone out to check on the cattle, came back in stamping snow off his boots and went straight to the stove to warm his hands, and didn't say anything mean when he saw the pot. Only Grant was absent. He was upstairs, she knew. She had heard his boots on the stairs an hour into the cooking, heard the muffled sound of his voice through the ceiling, talking to his father, or maybe just sitting with him, the way people do when they don't know what else to do. She pulled the beans off the soak just after 10 o'clock and started them cooking properly, slow and low, the way they needed. She added the first of the onion and pork stock, not all of it, carefully, building the flavor in layers the way Franklin had shown her, the way she'd figured out on her own over the years since. She added a pinch of thyme, just a pinch, and a bay leaf she found pressed between the pages of a notebook in the kitchen drawer, still fragrant. She did not know whose notebook it was or why a bay leaf had been pressed inside it, but she was grateful. Around 11 o'clock, Grant came back downstairs. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. The smell was different now. The whole first floor was different, in fact, the cooking broth having pushed the smell of cold and emptiness back into the corners where it belonged. He stood there with one hand on the door frame and his face doing something complicated. "He's worse," Grant said. "His breathing got worse in the last hour." "I know," she said. "That's going to happen before it gets better. The broth is almost ready." "You sound very certain." "I'm not certain of anything," she said. "But I know what I'm doing, and I know this is the right direction. That's the most anyone can offer." Grant looked at the pot, at the organized workspace around it. Everything she'd needed, pulled together and arranged with a precision that was evident even to someone who didn't cook. He looked at her hands, which were steady and sure, moving without hurry. "What do you need from me?" he said. It was such a small thing, that question. 4 words. But Abigail had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for someone to ask it, and the relief of it, quiet and private, not the kind she let show, was significant. "Fresh water from the well," she said, "brought up warm, and someone to bank the fire in his room properly and keep it banked through the night." "Hector," Grant said, turning to the ranch hand. "Already on it," Hector said, getting up. Grant stood in the doorway a moment longer. "I'll get the water," he said. He left. Abigail looked at the pot. She thought about Franklin. She thought about the first time she'd watched him save a man everyone else had given up on. A miner with blood poisoning, delirious in a canvas tent in the mountains west of Denver, 3 days from anyone who could help him. Franklin had used what he had. He had paid attention. He had stayed in that tent for 2 nights, and the miner had lived and gone back to his family. "It's not magic," Franklin had told her afterward. "It's just not giving up." She stirred the broth. It was not magic. It was navy beans and old salt pork and onions and herbs from the back of a shelf, and the cold particular attention of a woman who had learned to listen to what a body was saying. It was enough. She hoped it was enough. At 11:30, Presley fell asleep at the kitchen table with his head on his arms, and she covered him with a horse blanket from the hook by the door and let him sleep. He was 19 years old and had been awake since 4 in the morning. She did not have the heart to move him. At midnight, she tasted the broth for the first time. It was right. Not perfect. She had been working with imperfect materials and a stove she didn't yet know the temperament of, but right in the way that mattered. It had depth and warmth and something that Franklin would have called integrity, which was his word for a thing that had been made honestly and without shortcuts. She ladled a cup and took it upstairs. Silas Mercer's room was warmer now, Hector having built the fire back up properly and set a fresh log to catch. The old man was in roughly the same position she'd found him in earlier, but something had changed. His breathing, she thought. Slightly. The wet catch was still there, but it had eased, just a fraction. Or maybe she was imagining it because she needed to believe it. She sat beside the bed and she waited, and after a while Silas opened his eyes. They were blue eyes, washed pale with fever and age, but aware. That was the thing she noticed first. They were aware. He knew she was there. He was not so far gone as she'd feared. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "My name is Abigail," she said. "I'm the new housekeeper." His eyes moved over her in the way that people's eyes do when they are too tired to maintain pretense. No judgment in it, just assessment. The look of a man who has been around long enough to see past surfaces. "Grant hire you," he said. "I hired myself," she said. He's still deciding whether to accept it. Something moved in those eyes. It might have been amusement. Under other circumstances, it might even have been a smile. "That sounds like him," Silas said. "I have broth," she said. "I'm going to ask you to try to take some. Not much, just a spoonful at a time, very slowly. Your stomach won't accept more than that yet, and I don't want to push it." She paused. "But I need you to try." He looked at her for a long moment. "You think it'll help?" he said. It was not quite a question. "I think it'll give you something to fight with," she said. "Right now your body is spending everything it has on the fever. We need to give it more resources. This is the best I can do with what's available." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right." It was the quietest, simplest capitulation she had ever received, and it meant more than any of the louder ones. She took the spoon, and she began. Downstairs, Grant Mercer sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee in front of him and listened to the house. He had not meant to sit there. He had meant to go to bed. He'd been awake since before dawn, and his body was making its complaints known in all the usual ways. But he had come down for water, and the kitchen had been warm, and the smell of the broth had done something to him he couldn't quite account for. And he had sat down, and here he still was. He was thinking about what Abigail had said. He was thinking about the look on her face when she'd gone into the pantry and taken stock of what was there. Not dismay, not the look he'd expected, but something focused and practical. The look of someone who was already solving a problem while other people were still figming at the edges of it. He was thinking about the way she'd talked about her husband. He had assumed, looking at her, certain things. He was not proud of what those things were. He had assumed she was slow, clumsy, limited in some fundamental way that her appearance seemed to promise. He had assumed that her size told the whole story. He sat at the kitchen table in the warm kitchen that smelled like something that might save his father's life, and he reckoned with the fact that he had been wrong. Not just a little wrong, not slightly off wrong, substantially, specifically, embarrassingly wrong. He was not a man who liked being wrong. He had never been a man who liked being wrong. But he had been raised, his father had made sure of this, to acknowledge it when he was, because the alternative was being the kind of man who let his pride hurt the people around him, and Silas Mercer had not wanted that son. Silas Mercer had wanted better. Grant sat there in this warm kitchen, and he heard, from far upstairs, the barely audible sound of a spoon clinking against a cup. Once, twice, 3 times, slow and patient and steady, all through the night. He put his head in his hands. He did not sleep. But he did something that was in some ways harder. He sat there in the warm, broth-smelling kitchen, and he waited, and he hoped, and he let himself need an outcome he had not believed was possible that morning. That, for Grant Mercer, was a different kind of beginning. And somewhere above him, in a room that was finally warm enough, an old man was swallowing, one careful spoonful at a time, something that might carry him through to morning. Might. That was all anyone had, in the end. That particular word, and the long cold night, and someone stubborn enough to stay. Grant fell asleep at the kitchen table sometime around 2 in the morning. He did not mean to. One moment he was sitting there with the cold coffee and the weight of everything pressing down on him, and the next moment Hector was shaking his shoulder and gray light was coming through the kitchen window, and his neck had a crick in it that would take 2 days to work out. "She's still up there," Hector said when Grant looked at him. Grant straightened and pressed the heel of his hand into the back of his neck. "What?" "The woman. Abigail. She hasn't come down." Grant sat with that for a moment. The kitchen was still warm. Someone had kept the stove going through the night, which had not been him. And the pot was still on the heat, turned low, the broth doing whatever broth does when it sits and waits for the next person who needs it. He looked at the window. The light was the particular gray-blue of very early morning, before the sun had properly committed to rising, and the frost on the glass caught it and threw it back in small cold sparks. He had slept 4 hours at a kitchen table, and his father was either better or he wasn't, and Abigail Holloway had been upstairs in that room all night. He got up and went to the stairs. He could hear her before he reached the top. Not talking, not moving, just the quiet particular sound of someone present in a room. The door was still ajar the way she'd left it. He pushed it open. She was sitting in the straight-back chair she'd pulled close to the bed, her spine not quite against the back of it, her hands in her lap. She was awake. He could see that immediately. But she had the look of someone who has been awake through a long night and is now somewhere on the other side of fatigue, in that strange, clear place where tiredness stops being a feeling and becomes just the atmosphere you're breathing. Silas was asleep. Real sleep. Not the restless, fever-fighting kind Grant had been watching for 11 days. His face was slack in a way that meant his body had finally found a neutral, and his breathing, while still not right, was noticeably steadier than it had been the night before. Grant stood in the doorway for a long moment. Abigail glanced at him. "His fever came down about an hour ago," she said. Her voice was low, matter-of-fact, the voice of someone reporting a fact rather than announcing a victory. "Not gone, but down." He took close to a cup and a half of broth through the night, spread over about 4 hours. "A cup and a half," Grant repeated. "Small spoonfuls each time." He woke 3 times. The 3rd time he kept it down without difficulty. She looked back at Silas. "He needs to sleep now. Real sleep, not medicated sleep. His body knows what it needs to do." Grant looked at his father. He looked at the empty cup on the bedside table. He looked at the fire, which was banked perfectly. Someone had been tending it through the night, and that someone had been the woman in this chair, which meant she had been managing both things at once, the broth and the fire, and the patient and the long cold hours, without anyone helping her, and without anyone asking her to. "You need to sleep," he said. "I'm aware," she said. "There's a room at the end of the hall. It was the housekeeper's room. It's cold, but there are blankets." He paused. "I'll sit with him." She looked at him then. A full, direct look, the kind she'd been giving him since she walked through the door, and that he was only now starting to understand was not confrontational, but simply honest. She was assessing him, deciding if he could be trusted to do this one thing correctly. "Keep the fire banked," she said. "Not too high, not too low. You want steady warmth, not heat. If he wakes and asks for water, give it to him slowly. If he asks to sit up, help him, but don't let him get up on his own." She reached into her apron pocket and produced a small folded cloth, which she set on the bedside table. "That's dried chamomile. If he seems agitated or restless, put a pinch in a cup of hot water and let it steep for 5 minutes. It won't cure anything, but it'll help him rest." Grant took all of this in. "All right," he said. She stood up from the chair. She was stiff. He could see it in the way she moved, the careful deliberateness of someone whose joints have been in one position too long, but she did not make a sound about it. She moved the chair slightly, straightening it, and then she looked at Silas one more time with the particular expression of someone doing a final check before leaving a thing in another person's hands. "All right," she said, mostly to herself. She walked past Grant in the doorway. He stepped aside to let her pass. She smelled like wood smoke and broth, and the faint particular smell of an exhausted person who has been working too hard for too long. And there was nothing elegant about any of it, and somehow that was more convincing than anything else she could have done. She went down the hall to the room at the end, and he heard the door close. He sat down in the chair and looked at his father. Silas breathed in and out, slow and steady, the wet catch in his lungs marginally less audible than it had been. A cup and a half of broth. Grant put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and in the cold gray early morning of his father's bedroom, with the fire crackling low and steady the way she'd said to keep it, he sat with what he'd almost thrown away. She slept until noon. When she came downstairs, the kitchen was occupied in a way it hadn't been the day before. Hector was at the table with a mug and a plate of cornbread that he'd managed to produce from the half sack of cornmeal, slightly uneven and a bit scorched on one side, but present. Dawes was washing something in the basin. The back door was open to the cold air, and outside she could hear Presley's voice and the sound of a horse being worked. They all looked at her when she came in. Something had shifted in the way they looked at her. Not dramatically, not all at once, but the specific quality of the attention was different. Hector pushed the plate of cornbread toward the center of the table without saying anything, which was, she understood, an invitation. She sat down and took a piece of cornbread and ate it, and did not comment on the fact that it was scorched on one side, because it wasn't the taste that mattered. "How's the old man?" Hector asked. "Better than he was. Not well yet." She looked at the pot on the stove. "Who kept it going?" "I did," Dawes said from the basin. He said it with his back to her, scrubbing at something. "You left it on low. I just made sure the fire didn't go out." She looked at the back of his head for a moment. He was the one who had been saying things in the dark last night, the one she'd heard and chosen not to address. He was 23 years old, maybe 24, and he had the particular defensive posture of a young man who has realized he was wrong about something, but hasn't yet worked out how to say it. "Thank you," she said. He turned around. He looked like he'd been expecting something else. "Yeah," he said. "Sure." She ate the rest of the cornbread and drank the coffee Hector poured for her without being asked, and then she stood up and went back to the stove and looked at the broth. It had concentrated down through the night and morning, the beans having broken apart and thickened the base, and what was left was something darker and richer than what she'd started with. She tasted it, too thick now, past the point of being easy to take for a sick man, and reached for the water pitcher. She was in the middle of adjusting it when she heard boots on the stairs, and then Grant was in the kitchen doorway. He looked worse than she felt, which was saying something. He had the 2-day beard that had now tipped into 3-day territory, and the particular pallor of someone who has been running on adrenaline and coffee and not much else for almost 2 weeks. He moved to the stove and stood beside her without preamble. "He woke up at 9, Grant said. Asked where you were. When I told him you were sleeping, he said good. Did he take water?" 2 cups. He asked for food. He paused. "I told him not yet." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I didn't know if it was right." It was a straightforward answer. She appreciated its honesty. "It might be," she said. "Depends on what he wants and how his stomach is feeling. The broth first. If he keeps it down easily and asks again in a couple of hours, we can try something light. Cornmeal gruel, maybe, or soft beans." She stirred the pot. "I'll go up in a bit." Grant stood there another moment. He was clearly working toward something. She waited. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Go ahead." "The things you said yesterday, about what my husband taught you, about reading a patient." He looked at the pot rather than at her. "Were you actually trained, or is that, how much of this is something you learned properly and how much is it intuition?" she said. "I was going to say guesswork." She didn't bristle. The question was fair, even if the word wasn't kind. "It's both," she said. "What Franklin taught me was proper. He was methodical about it, made me read the same books he had, and then work through what we observed against what the book said. 6 years of that is not nothing." She paused, adding water to the pot, watching the consistency shift. "The intuition is built on the training. It's not separate from it. The difference between someone who guesses and someone who reads a situation correctly is usually just whether they know what they're looking at." Grant was quiet for a moment. "And you know what you're looking at?" "With this?" "Yes." He looked at her profile while she worked. She was aware of it the way she was always aware of being looked at. A low background awareness, like knowing where the exits in a room are, but she did not adjust herself to it or perform anything for his benefit. "I was wrong about you yesterday," he said. It came out flat and plain, which was probably the only way he knew how to say it. She thought about what it had cost him, a man like Grant, in this world, at this time, to say those 5 words. "I know," she said. Not to wound him, just because it was true. You'll have to decide what to do with that. She heard him exhale. What does that mean? It means that telling me you were wrong is the beginning of something, not the end of it. She turned to look at him directly. I'm not interested in an apology that changes nothing. I'm interested in what happens next in this house, and whether I can do my work without the same argument I had with you at the door. He held her gaze. She held his. Neither of them looked away. You can, he said. All right then, she said. She turned back to the pot. The neighbors arrived that afternoon. She had not been told to expect them, which meant either Grant had not known or Grant had forgotten, and when she looked at his face when the wagon rolled into the yard, she determined it was the latter, the quick unconscious tightening around his eyes that meant something had slipped his mind in the chaos of the past 2 weeks. There were 3 of them, a woman named Cecilia Marsh, who ran the neighboring Marsh Ranch with her husband, and 2 younger women whose names Abigail caught in passing, Ruth and someone who might have been Flora, though she wasn't certain. They came in the way that frontier women come to a sick neighbor's house, with covered dishes and direct manner, and the assumption of access that comes from years of mutual reliance in hard country. Cecilia Marsh was a tall, angular woman in her mid-50s, with the kind of face that had been handsome in youth and had aged into something more interesting. She walked into the kitchen and stopped when she saw Abigail at the stove. The look on her face was not unkind. It was more than that. It was the specific expression of a person confronted with something they hadn't expected and are making rapid internal adjustments to accommodate. You must be the housekeeper, Cecilia said. Abigail Holloway, she said, and you're from the Marsh Ranch. Grant mentioned it this morning. He hadn't, actually, but this was the kind of social management that Abigail had long since learned to perform without thinking about it. Give people an easy entry point, let them feel the territory is familiar, and the conversation goes smoother for everyone. Cecilia set her covered dish on this counter. We heard Silas is poorly. We've been worried. How is he? Improving, Abigail said. Slowly. His fever came down last night and he slept this morning. Dr. Aldrin did what he could. I've been supplementing. Cecilia looked at the pot. At Abigail. Back at this pot. Supplementing how? Broth. Hydration, keeping the room warm overnight. She turned the heat down slightly under the pot. His body needed resources to fight with. The quinine was handling the symptom but not addressing the underlying depletion. Cecilia was quiet for a moment. Behind her, the 2 younger women were placing their dishes on the table and looking at Abigail with an attention that was trying to present itself as casual and not quite succeeding. You have medical knowledge, Cecilia said. Some. My husband was a physician. Another adjustment behind Cecilia's eyes. The recalibration of a smart woman encountering a person who does not fit the category she'd initially assigned them to. Well, Cecilia said, that's useful. She said it simply, without the layered undertone that the same words from Grant the day before would have carried. Abigail appreciated the directness of it. It has been, Abigail said. The younger women, Ruth definitely, and the other one who turned out to be named Alma, not Flora, sat down at the kitchen table and helped themselves to coffee with the ease of people who had been in this kitchen before. Ruth was perhaps 25 and openly curious in a way she made no effort to conceal. Alma was a few years younger and quieter, the kind of quiet that is usually attention in disguise. So you just got here yesterday? Ruth asked. Yesterday afternoon. And you've been up all night with Silas? Yes. Ruth considered this. Cecilia's been trying to get someone out here for 2 weeks. Nobody wanted to come. The road. And with him being sick, people were worried about. She stopped herself, glanced at Cecilia. About the fever spreading, Cecilia finished calmly, which is a reasonable concern. I wasn't worried, Abigail said. She was not saying it as a point of pride. It was just the truth. Why not? Alma asked. It was the first thing she'd said. Her voice was younger than her face suggested. Abigail thought about this honestly before she answered. Because I've been in rooms with sick people for most of my adult life, and I know how to manage exposure, and because somebody needed to be here. She turned back to the stove. The calculation wasn't complicated. There was a brief silence, and then Cecilia said something that Abigail would think about later, unpacking it in the quiet of the housekeeper's room at the end of the hall. Silas is lucky you answered that advertisement. It was not a dramatic declaration. It was a practical, measured statement from a practical, measured woman. But it landed somewhere specific in Abigail's chest, not quite in the place where praise usually lands, somewhere more like the place where recognition lands, which is different and rarer and matters more. "We'll see," Abigail said. Well, Grant took the neighbors up to see Silas, and while they were upstairs, Abigail began preparing the afternoon broth. The pot needed freshening. She added water, adjusted the seasoning, considered the consistency. The beans had given everything they had to give, and she separated them out now, reserving some of the soft ones for the gruel she was planning. She worked through the arithmetic of the remaining stores. The pork was nearly gone, maybe one more day of real flavoring left in it. The beans were half depleted. The herbs would last if she used them carefully. She was doing this arithmetic, mentally mapping what was there against what the next several days would require, when she heard footsteps on the back porch and looked up to find a man she hadn't seen before standing in the doorway. He was perhaps 50, heavy through the chest, wearing a sheepskin coat that had seen better days. He had the weathered, squinting look of a man who spent most of his time outdoors and had opinions about it. "You the new cook?" he said. "Housekeeper," she said. "And currently the cook, yes." He looked her over in the deliberate way of a man who sees nothing rude in it. "Heard they got somebody in. Didn't expect—" He stopped. "Didn't expect what?" she asked. Not aggressively, just with the patience of someone who has time for the answer. He had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Well, somebody like you, I suppose." "Somebody large," she said. He shifted his weight. "I was going to say somebody from the city." She let that sit for a moment, let him hear how thin it sounded. Then, "I was in Denver. Before that, a mining town outside of Colorado Springs. Before that, a homestead in Nebraska that doesn't exist anymore." She looked back at the pot. "I'm not from the city." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My name's Fowler. I run the spread east of here." "Abigail Holloway." He came the rest of the way into the kitchen and stood awkwardly in the way of a man who has said something he regrets but doesn't know the path back from it. She did not help him find it. She kept working. "Silas going to make it?" he asked after a while. "I believe so," she said. "He's stronger than his son thinks he is." Fowler made a sound, half laugh, half something more complicated. "Silas is the strongest man in this county, has been for 30 years. He paused. "It scared people when he got sick. When something that solid goes down, it makes you think about your own. It makes you think." "Yes," she said. "It does." She looked at him then, and he looked at her, and some of the earlier stiffness had gone out of the exchange. He was not a bad man. She could see that. He was just a man who had learned to read the world a certain way and was currently being asked to revise his reading, which was uncomfortable for anyone. "You need anything?" he said. "Fowler Spread has got more stores than we've been using. If Silas needs supplies—" "He needs beef broth in a few days," she said, "when he's ready for something stronger. If you've got bones you're not using." "I've got bones." He nodded. "I'll send them over." "Thank you," she said. He left the way he'd come, through the back, and she heard his boots on the frozen ground, and then the sound of a horse. She stood at the stove and thought, this is how it works out here. Not with apologies, not with speeches, with bones, with firewood. With a person showing up when they said they would, she could work with that. The women stayed until late afternoon, and when they left, Cecilia pressed Abigail's hand in the doorway and told her she'd be back in 3 days. "You shouldn't need to be," Abigail said. "He should be past the worst of it by then." Cecilia looked at her for a moment. "I'll come anyway," she said. Grant stood on the porch and watched the wagon go, and then he stood there for a while after it was out of sight, looking at the road. Abigail came to stand beside him. Not too close. This was not the easy proximity of familiarity yet, just two people who happened to be looking in the same direction. "Cecilia liked you," he said. "She was kind," Abigail said. "Cecilia Marsh is not kind by nature," Grant said. "She's principled. That's different and, in the long run, more useful." He paused. "When she likes someone, it means something." Abigail did not say anything to this. She watched the last of the wagon dust settle on the frozen road. "Fowler was out back," she said. "He's sending over beef bones." Grant turned to look at her. "He was here? I didn't see him come in." Back door, he wanted to know how your father was doing. She paused. He was surprised by me. Was he rude? She thought about this honestly. He tried not to be. He didn't entirely succeed. She looked at the road. But he's sending the bones. Grant was quiet for a moment. That's Fowler. His wife died and he never replaced any of the good manners she took with her. But he'd give you the coat off his back. I'm not interested in his coat, she said. The bones will do. Something in Grant's posture shifted. It was subtle, barely anything, really. But she had been reading people's bodies for long enough to see it. Some release, some small private lowering of a guard that had been up so long it had become part of the architecture. I'm going to ride into Carvel tomorrow, he said. We need supplies. I should have gone last week, but... He stopped. The rest of that sentence was obvious. While you're there, she said, see if there's any dried elderberry or willow bark at the apothecary. If Dr. Aldrin comes before you're back, tell him the fever broke and the breathing is easier but still not right. He'll want to listen to the lungs. Grant looked at her. Elderberry. For the lungs. It's an old treatment and some doctors don't hold with it, but Franklin used it and I've seen it work. She turned toward the door. Tell me what's available and I'll work out what to do with it. Do you always? Grant started. She looked back at him. He rethought whatever he'd been about to say. Never mind, he said. Do I always what? Have a plan, he said, for every situation, before anyone else has even finished figuring out there's a situation. She considered this. Usually, she said, it irritates some people. I imagine it does, he said. She couldn't tell if that was a criticism or not. With him, it was often difficult to tell. She decided not to ask. She went back inside. At 4 o'clock, Silas Mercer asked for something to eat. Grant had gone up to relieve Abigail mid-afternoon so she could get the kitchen organized for the evening, and she was downstairs shredding the remaining soft beans and mixing them with a small amount of the cornmeal and enough of the broth to make a soft, warm mass that would be easy to digest, when she heard Grant's voice through the ceiling and then Silas's voice answering, too low to make out the words. But the fact of the exchange, the back and forth of it, the steadiness of both voices. She covered the small pot she was using and carried it upstairs. Silas was propped up against the headboard. It was the first time she'd seen him at anything other than horizontal, and the difference it made, even like this, even still clearly sick, with the hollows in his cheeks and the gray cast to his skin, was significant. He looked like a man again, rather than a body enduring something. Grant stood by the window looking out at the yard. He turned when she came in. He says he wants real food, Grant said, with the expression of a man reporting a problem. That's a good sign, she said. I know it's a good sign, but he asked for beef stew. He can't have beef stew. I know that. Tell him. Silas looked at her from the bed. Up close, with him conscious and upright, she could see the blue eyes that Grant had gotten from him. The same direct assessing quality, the same discomfort with hedging. The beef stew can wait a few days, she told him. I've been eating broth for 12 days, Silas said. You've been eating nothing for 12 days. The broth is new. She set the small pot on the table beside him. This is a step up from broth. Beans and cornmeal and some of the broth base. Soft enough not to work your stomach too hard. Substantial enough to start giving you something back. She looked at him. It's not beef stew, but it's not nothing. He looked at the pot. Then he looked at her. You made it? Yes. Same as the broth? Similar principle. He picked up the spoon himself, and she did not miss how significant that was, the fact that he had the strength to do it, and tasted it. He ate in silence. Not all of it, about half, which was right, which was about what his stomach could manage. When he set the spoon down, he looked at the window, and then at her and said, Grant tells me you were up all night. Yes. With me. Yes. He said nothing for a moment. Outside, the light was starting to flatten toward evening, the pale winter afternoon beginning its early collapse. The fire crackled. Why? He asked. It was a genuine question, without subtext, not the suspicious why of someone looking for an angle, but the direct, slightly bewildered why of a man who cannot entirely account for the presence of a stranger beside his bed in the small hours of a frozen January night. Because you needed someone there, she said. And I was there. He looked at her for a long moment. Grant had gone very still by the window. What's your name? Silas asked. Grant told me, but I wasn't. The fever. Abigail Holloway. He said it back to himself quietly, the way people do when they want to fix something in memory. Holloway. He looked at her hands. Your husband was a doctor? A physician, yes. Franklin Holloway. He practiced in Denver and in the mining camps west of Colorado Springs. He trained you? As much as he could, she said. Silas was quiet for a moment. He looked at the half-eaten bowl of food, and then at the empty cup from the broth, and then back at her. He was doing an accounting of the past 18 hours, she understood, adding up what was there now against what had been there before she arrived, arriving at a number that meant something. My son didn't want to take you on, he said. I know. He told you. He showed me. Silas made the sound again that might have been a laugh. She was more certain this time. That sounds like him. He settled back against the pillows, but carefully, the careful movement of a man who has learned in the last 12 days not to do anything too fast. What do you need? She looked at him. Pardon? To do your work here, what do you need? He met her eyes. We're not a rich operation, but we're not nothing. What do you need to run this house? She thought about the pantry, the empty shelves, the gaps where the staples should have been. She thought about the ride Grant was making tomorrow. A properly stocked larder to start, she said. After that, just the authority to manage it without a committee. Done, Silas said. Grant. Grant turned from the window. The woman runs the house, Silas said. You run the cattle. Don't let the two jobs bleed into each other. Grant held his father's gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Abigail. Then he looked back at his father. Fine, he said. It was not gracious, but it was real, and it was clear. And it landed in the room the way things land when they have the weight of genuine authority behind them. Abigail noted it, filed it, set it next to the conversation in the kitchen that morning, and next to Cecilia Marsh's hand pressed briefly against hers in the doorway, and next to Fowler's gruff offer of bones. She was accumulating something in this house. She could not have named it exactly, but it was there. That night she made a proper supper for the ranch hands, cornbread, the beans refried with a scrape of lard and the last of the salt, coffee that was stronger than it had been because she'd found a sealed tin at the very back of the top shelf that Grant apparently hadn't known was there. It was not abundant, but it was organized. It was purposeful. There was enough of it. Dawes ate 2 full plates and didn't say anything crude at all, which she counted as a form of apology. Presley told her it was the best supper he'd had since Darla left, and then immediately looked worried, like he'd implied something he hadn't meant to. I'll take that, she said. Darla's been doing this a lot longer than I have. Darla could burn water, Hector said mildly, into his coffee cup. Presley choked on something. She left them there laughing and went upstairs to check on Silas one more time before the night. He was asleep, really asleep, the deep, untroubled kind. His breathing was steadier than it had been that morning, steadier than it had been all week, and the color in his face was no longer purely gray. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at him. This was the most dangerous time, in a way. The moment when things looked better was the moment when people relaxed, when the vigilance dropped, when the patient overdid it and set themselves back 3 days. She would have to be careful. She would have to keep being careful when everyone else had decided the crisis was over. She thought about all the ways this could still go wrong. Then she pulled the door almost closed and went down the hall to her room and took off her boots and lay down on top of the covers without undressing, because she had learned a long time ago that sick people often needed you most in the hour when you'd just let yourself believe you could rest, and she wanted to be ready to move quickly if she heard anything. She was asleep within 4 minutes. The house settled around her, the cold outside pressing against the walls, the fire in the main room burning low and steady, the Blackstone Ranch holding itself together around the fragile, improving fact of one old man's breathing, in the dark and the winter, one more night. She woke at 5:30 to the sound of coughing. Not the shallow, fever-damp coughing she'd been hearing for 2 days. This was different, deeper. The kind that comes from something trying to move in the lungs, which could mean things were getting better or could mean things were about to get worse. And the difference between those two outcomes depended entirely on what happened in the next few hours. She was in the hall before she was fully awake, boots in hand, pulling them on as she walked. Silas's door was open. She had left it ajar, the same way she'd left it every night, and now the gap was wider. Grant had beaten her there, was standing at the foot of the bed looking at his father with the expression of a man who has run out of the particular kind of patience that has really just held fear. Silas was sitting up. That was the first thing she clocked. Sitting up on his own, not the propped against the headboard arrangement she'd set up the previous afternoon, but actually upright, his feet over the edge of the bed, his hands braced on the mattress on either side of him. I was coughing into a cloth and his face was red with the effort of it, but his eyes, when they found hers over the cloth, were sharp. "Don't," she said immediately to Grant, who had moved toward Silas with some intention she hadn't quite read yet. "Don't pull him back down. Let him cough." Grant stopped. He needs to cough," she said, moving to the other side of the bed, crouching slightly to be at Silas's eye level. "The fluid in the lungs has to move. That's what this is. It's worse before it's better." She looked at Silas. "Keep going. Don't fight it." Silas did not look like he needed the instruction. He was already doing it, coughing with the focused, grim persistence of someone who understands instinctively what their body is trying to do, even if the doing of it felt like being turned inside out. She put one hand flat between his shoulder blades, not pressing, just present, feeling the movement of his back with each cough. It went on for several minutes. Grant stood at the foot of the bed and said nothing, which was the right thing to do and clearly cost him something. When it eased, Silas sat for a moment with the cloth in his lap, breathing. The breathing was different now. She could hear it, the change in it. Still not clear, not entirely, but the wet heaviness was less. Something had shifted in there. "Water," she said. Grant had already moved to the pitcher. He brought the glass and held it out toward his father, and Silas took it and drank slowly, and some of the red came out of his face. "That was unpleasant," Silas said. "Yes," she said. "How do your lungs feel now?" He thought about this in the careful way of a man taking an honest inventory. "Like something's been wrung out," he said. "That's the right description," she said. "The fluid was sitting there. The coughing is moving it." She straightened up. "This is going to happen a few more times over the next day or two. It needs to happen. Don't try to suppress it." "I wasn't planning to," Silas said dryly. "Your son might try to suppress it on your behalf," she said, "because it sounds alarming." Grant from the corner of the room. "I'm standing right here." "I know," she said. Silas made the sound that was becoming familiar, that half-swallowed thing that was his version of a laugh. He handed the glass back to Grant and looked at the window, where the pre-dawn dark was just barely beginning to think about becoming something else. "What time is it?" he asked. "Early," she said. "Go back to sleep if you can. The more rest you get, the faster this moves." "I want more of that food," he said. "The bean thing. In an hour, when you've settled from the coughing." She picked up the cloth from his lap and folded it so the used side was contained. "Lie back down." "I don't—" "Mr. Mercer." He looked at her. "You walked yourself to the edge of dying," she said, not unkindly. "You do not get to decide you're better yet. That's my job right now." Something moved across his face. Not offense, not quite. It was more like the expression of a man who is accustomed to running everything and has encountered, possibly for the first time in a considerable while, someone who is not remotely intimidated by that fact. He lay back down. Grant met her eyes across the bed, and there was something in his look she hadn't seen before. Not the suspicion of the first day or the careful reevaluation of the second. Something closer to relief. And underneath the relief, the particular gratitude that people feel when someone else takes charge of a situation they have been failing to manage alone. She did not acknowledge it directly. She tucked the blanket and checked the fire and went to get the water warmed for the chamomile. Grant left for Carvel at first light. She stood on the porch and watched the wagon go down the frozen road and made a mental list of everything she'd sent him for. Elderberry if the apothecary had it, willow bark, a new supply of dried beans and cornmeal and salt, coffee, and a piece of salt pork that was not 3 months old. Fowler had said he'd send the bones, but she wasn't sure when, so she'd told Grant to check at the general store for any beef they might have that she could use. He had written the list down, which she had not expected. He had stood at the kitchen table with a scrap of paper and a pencil and written it down as she said it, and when she'd finished, he'd read it back to her and asked if there was anything else. She had added dried apples to the list, because when Silas was ready for something that wasn't beans, A soft cooked apple with a pinch of the remaining sugar she'd found at the very back of the pantry would be a gentler transition than most things she could make from what was there. Grant had written it down. It was a small thing, but it meant something. Now the wagon was gone and the road was empty, and the morning cold was the kind that went straight through everything, and she turned and went back inside. Hector was at the stove, keeping it going, and he had made a reasonable attempt at porridge from the last of the cornmeal. She looked at it and adjusted the heat and added a bit more water, and Hector watched without comment, the comfortable silence of people who have been in the same kitchen through enough difficulty to be past the need to fill every moment. "You slept?" he asked. "Some." "He's better?" "Getting there." She looked at the ceiling. "The coughing this morning is good, actually. The lungs are clearing." Hector nodded. He stirred his coffee. After a moment, he said, "I've worked this ranch for 11 years. Since before Grant's mother died." She looked at him. He's not just a boss," Hector said. He was working out how to say something, and she waited for him to find it. "Some of the men who work for him, they've got nowhere else to go. He knows that, and he doesn't use it, if you know what I mean. He just gives them the work and treats them decently and expects the same back." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "I'd rather take a beating than watch him die." "He's not going to die," she said. "You can't know that." "No," she said. "But I know more than I did 2 days ago, and 2 days ago I wasn't certain, and now I am. Not certain of everything. I'm never certain of everything, but certain of the direction. He's moving the right way." Hector looked at her for a long moment. He had the face of a man who has learned not to trust easy comfort, who has had easy comfort fail him too many times to take it at face value. But this, she understood, was not easy comfort. This was a measured assessment from someone who had been in that room and knew what they'd observed, and he could hear the difference. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. She took the porridge up at 7, and Silas ate most of it, and did not complain about the beef stew once. Dr. Aldrin came at mid-morning. She had not met him yet. He was the physician who'd been coming twice a week, the one who'd left the brown bottle and the quinine and done what he could in the time available. She had formed a picture of him from the results of his work. Competent but overstretched, dealing with too many patients across too wide a geography to give any one of them the sustained attention they needed. The man who came through the front door was perhaps 60, short and round-shouldered, with a black bag and the kind of beard that had given up trying to be neat. He looked at her over his glasses when she answered the door, and she watched him form his first impression and then revise it, the same two-step she'd seen half a dozen times in the past 2 days. "You must be the housekeeper," he said. "Abigail Holloway." She stepped back to let him in. "Grant asked me to tell you the fever broke 2 nights ago, and the breathing is cleaner this morning after a productive coughing episode around 5:30. Aldrin stopped in the hallway. "He told you to tell me that?" "He did." She closed the door. "He rode to Carvel this morning for supplies. He said you'd want to know about the lungs specifically." Aldrin was looking at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, more like the heightened attention of someone who has received unexpectedly specific information and is adjusting his expectations accordingly. "You've been managing his care?" "Supporting it," she said. "The broth, the room temperature, keeping him hydrated. I didn't change the medication." "The broth," Aldrin said. "Navy beans, salt pork, onion, and herb stock, built up over a slow heat." She was already moving toward the stairs. "He's been able to tolerate increasingly substantial food over the past 24 hours. I'm planning to introduce soft-cooked apple this afternoon if he keeps the morning meal down." Aldrin followed her up the stairs with an expression she couldn't quite read because she was in front of him and could only hear his footsteps. They were the footsteps of a man who is thinking. In Silas's room, the old rancher was awake and upright against the headboard, with the particular alert look of a man who has decided he has been sick long enough and is actively negotiating with his own body about how much longer this is going to go on. "John," he said when Aldrin came in. "Silas." Aldrin set his bag on the chair and bent to listen to the old man's chest. He was there for a long time, moving the listening end of the stethoscope. She recognized it. Franklin had had one. To different positions, his face still and focused in the particular way of someone parsing information through sound. When he straightened up, he looked at Abigail. "What did you give him for the lungs?" he asked. "Nothing yet," she said. "The chamomile for the restlessness. I've been keeping the room warm and making sure he doesn't lie flat for too long at a stretch. She paused. Grant is bringing elderberry from the apothecary if they have it. For what purpose? To continue supporting the lung clearing. My husband used a tincture. Aldrin looked at her over his glasses. Your husband was a physician? Franklin Holloway. He practiced in Denver. Something crossed Aldrin's face, not recognition exactly, but the particular expression of someone locating a name in a mental index. Holloway. He thought for a moment. He wrote something for the Denver Medical Society on pulmonary complications in the mining camps. She blinked. She had not expected that. Yes. He published 2 papers, in 76 and 78. Aldrin nodded slowly, as though something had clicked into place. He looked at Silas, then back at Abigail. The elderberry is reasonable, he said. Keep the room warm as you have been. The coughing this morning is a good sign. The mucus is moving. If there's another episode like it in the next day, don't be alarmed, but come and get me if it goes on longer than 20 minutes, or if there's blood in what he brings up. There won't be blood, she said. The infection is bacterial, not... I know, Aldrin said. I'm telling you anyway, in case I'm wrong. She looked at him. He looked at her. There was a beat of mutual recognition. 2 people who had spent time in the same territory, who spoke the same language, even if they had arrived there by different roads. I'll send word if anything changes, she said. Aldrin looked at Silas. You're in good hands, he said, and it was not a pleasantry. Silas, who had been watching this entire exchange with the bright, interested look of a man who is sick but not incapacitated, said, I know that. Yum. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors. She was in the kitchen when she heard the horses, more than 1, 3 at least, coming up the road at a pace that was faster than the usual approach of a neighbor coming to check on things. She wiped her hands and went to the window. 3 men on horseback, none of them Grant, none of them anyone she recognized. The one in front was perhaps 45, well-dressed in the frontier way, good coat, decent horse, with a face she couldn't read from the window but a manner she could, the manner of someone arriving with a purpose. She went to the door. The man in front had dismounted by the time she opened it. Up close, the face was handsome in an ordinary way, with pale eyes and a close-trimmed beard starting to go gray. He looked at her the way people did, and then looked past her at the house. I'm looking for Silas Mercer, he said, or his son. Grant's in Carvel. Silas is unwell. I'm the housekeeper. She looked at the 2 men still on horseback, who had the unhelpful quality of men who follow orders and are not interested in your assessment of whether those orders are good ones. What's your business? My name is Callum Reese, the man said. I have an appointment with Silas. He made an appointment while he was too sick to stand, she said. I don't think he did. Something tightened around Reese's eyes. It was subtle, and he covered it quickly. I've had correspondence with him, about a land matter. He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. I can leave this for him. You can leave it with me, she said. She held out her hand. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. She kept her expression politely neutral, the way Franklin had taught her by example. You got further with calm than with anything else, he always said, because the other person spent their energy trying to get a reaction out of you and wore themselves out before you did. Reese put the envelope in her hand. I'll call again when Silas is receiving visitors, he said. That would be wise, she said. She watched them ride out and then went back inside and set the envelope on the kitchen table. Hector had materialized from somewhere. The man had a gift for appearing in kitchens at relevant moments, and he stood looking at the envelope. Reese, he said. You know him? Hector's face did a thing. It was not a simple thing. It was layered, the expression of someone with a complicated piece of knowledge, and not yet certain how much to say about it. I know of him, he said carefully. He's been making offers on land in this area for about 6 months. Smaller spreads mostly. Places that have had a bad year or 2. She looked at him. What kind of offers? Low ones? Hector said. Very low. She looked at the envelope. Is there a land matter between him and Silas that you know of? She said. Not that Silas has mentioned, Hector said, and Silas mentions things. She picked up the envelope. The correspondence on the outside was addressed to Silas Mercer in a clean, formal hand. She turned it over, sealed. She set it back down. When Grant gets back, she said, Make sure he sees this before anything else. You think it's trouble, Hector said. She thought about Reese's eyes when she'd held out her hand, the tightening, the speed with which he'd covered it. I think it's worth being careful, she said. And then she went back to the stove, because the afternoon broth needed tending and Silas needed feeding, and trouble, whatever shape it was going to take, would still be there after the work was done. Silas had a second coughing episode at 2 in the afternoon. She was upstairs when it started. She had taken to spending an hour with him in the afternoons, not doing anything specific, just present, reading from the one book she'd found in the housekeeper's room if he seemed to want it, or just sitting if he didn't. He liked the sitting, she had learned. He was not a man who needed entertainment. He needed company, and he needed it to be undemanding, and she could do that. The coughing came on fast. One moment he was quiet, looking at the ceiling in the way he sometimes did, working through something in his head, she thought, the mental accounting of a man who had been pulled out of his routine and was catching up on things. And the next moment he was lurching forward and coughing with the same deep, productive force as that morning. She got to him quickly, one hand on his back, and she felt the coughing working through him in long waves, and she breathed slowly and deliberately even though she could hear how bad it sounded, because she knew that how she responded would determine how he responded, and a sick man who panics makes everything harder. He coughed for 9 minutes by the clock on the bedside table. When it finished, he sat for a long moment, breathing through his mouth, the cloth pressed to his face. She kept her hand on his back and said nothing, which was the right thing. She'd learned that from Franklin, too, who had believed in the particular power of physical presence without verbal interference. That was worse than the morning, Silas said. It was longer, she said, but what came up was different, less fluid. She handed him the water glass. It's clearing. He drank, set the glass down. I was exhausted. She could see it in the way his shoulders sat, the weight in them. You've been through this before, he said. It was not a question. With my husband's patients, yes, a few times. She took the cloth and replaced it with a fresh one from the stack she'd put on the bedside table that morning. And once with Franklin himself, the year before he died. He got a respiratory infection in the camps. Not typhoid, something else. I spent 2 weeks nursing him through it. Did he recover? From that one, yes. She folded the used cloth. He was well for about a year after, and then the typhoid. Silas was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man about to say something carefully. You've had a hard time of it. She considered whether to answer that honestly or to give the easy version. Yes, she said, for some years. Why'd you come out here? All the way out here, I mean. There must be work in Denver for a woman with your skills. There is, she said. There was. She looked at the window. I needed somewhere different. I'd been in Denver long enough that everywhere I went, I was Franklin's widow. I wanted to be somewhere I was just myself. He looked at her for a long moment. And are you? Here? It was a question she hadn't expected from him, and it surprised something out of her. A small, involuntary softening, the kind she didn't usually let happen. Getting there, she said. He nodded. He lay back against the pillows with the careful movements of someone who has learned to respect their body's current limitations. My wife Clara, he said to the ceiling. She died 12 years ago. Fever, different kind than this one. He paused. Grant was 21. He took it in a certain way. Became very practical about things. He paused again, very quick to judge. She did not say anything, because she understood that this was not an explanation being offered on Grant's behalf. It was a piece of information being set out for her to consider. He was wrong about you, Silas said. He told me, she said. I know, he told me he told you. He looked at the ceiling. Did he do it well? She thought about the kitchen table, the 5 flat words. I was wrong about you. He did it plainly, she said, which I found more convincing than elaborate. Silas almost smiled. That's his mother's word. Plain. He closed his eyes. She liked plain people, said it was easier to trust them. A pause. I think she would have liked you. The house was very quiet for a moment. Get some rest, Abigail said. He did not argue. Grant came back from Carvel at 4:30, later than she'd expected, and when the wagon pulled into the yard, she knew from the set of his shoulders before he'd even climbed down that something had happened in town. She met him at the back door. He came in carrying two large crates with the deliberate, slightly contained movement of a man sorting through information and not yet ready to share all of it. The elderberry was there, he said, setting the first crate on the table. And the willow bark. The rest is... He gestured at the crates. What happened in town? She said. He looked at her. There was a moment where she thought he was going to say nothing happened. People were talking, he said, about my father, about how sick he is. He lifted the second crate. There's talk that if he doesn't pull through, there are people interested in the Blackstone. She thought of the envelope on the kitchen table and went and picked it up and handed it to him without comment. He looked at it, at the name on the front. His face did something brief and complicated. Reese came by this afternoon, she said. He said he had an appointment with your father. He didn't have an appointment with my father, Grant said. His voice was very flat. That's what I thought, she said. He turned the envelope over, looked at the seal, looked at her. Did you read it? It's not addressed to me. He held the envelope for a moment, something working in his jaw. Then he broke the seal and read it. She watched his face while he read. She was not trying to read the contents from his expression. She was reading him, the way she read everyone, cataloging what was there beneath the surface. What she saw was a man finding out something he had suspected and had hoped was not true. He's been sending letters for 6 months, Grant said, when he put it down. This is the third one. The first two went to a box at the post office in Carvel. My father never mentioned them to me. Maybe he didn't think they needed mentioning, she said. Maybe he thought he'd handled it. Maybe. He folded the letter back along its original creases. Reese is claiming a right of first purchase on 40 acres of the eastern pasture. He's saying my father agreed to it verbally 2 years ago. He set the letter down. My father did not agree to that. Can you prove he didn't? Grant looked at her. What do you mean? I mean, is there documentation, a record of what was agreed or not agreed 2 years ago regarding the eastern pasture? He was quiet for a moment. I don't know. My father keeps his papers in the office. Then that's where you need to look, she said. Not urgently, not with the edge of alarm she might reasonably have felt, just steadily, practically, the way she addressed most things. Not tonight, because you're tired and tired men make mistakes reading documents. But tomorrow morning. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. When did you get practical about everything? I've always been practical, she said. Most people don't notice at first because they're too busy noticing other things. He said nothing to that. He picked up the letter and put it in his coat pocket and started unloading the crates. The elderberry was there, a good quantity of it, dried, in a sealed paper package. The willow bark, salt pork, fresh, 2 pounds of dried beans, cornmeal, coffee, salt. And at the bottom of the second crate, wrapped in paper, dried apples. She looked at the dried apples. He had remembered the dried apples. She did not make anything of it. She put the supplies away in the pantry, organizing them properly, the way the pantry should have been organized all along. Staples at the front, reserves at the back, everything labeled and in order. When she finished, the shelves were not full. There was still more space than goods. But they were organized, and organized was the beginning of something. She stood in the pantry doorway for a moment and looked at it. Behind her, she heard Grant come to the kitchen doorway and stop. My father's better, she said. It was not a question. I heard him talking when I came upstairs, Grant said. He sounds different. His lungs are clearing, she said. He had 2 coughing episodes today. The second was harder, but what came up was less. That means the fluid is resolving. She came out of the pantry. He needs another 2 or 3 days of careful management. No sudden changes in temperature, no sitting outside even if he asks, no beef stew yet. He asked you for beef stew again? He mentioned it, she said. I declined on his behalf. Grant stood in the kitchen doorway with his coat still on and something in his face that was not quite expression, more like the residue of expression. A long day's worth of things felt and managed and not yet processed. He looked tired in a way that was deeper than sleep deprivation. He looked like a man who had been holding everything together for a very long time and was starting to feel the weight of all that holding. Sit down, she said. I'll warm up the broth. You don't need to. I'm doing it anyway, she said. Sit down. He sat down. She heated the broth and cut a piece of the new cornbread she'd made in the afternoon and put it in front of him without ceremony, and poured herself a cup of coffee and sat across the table from him. He ate. She did not fill the silence, and he did not seem to need her to. After a while, he said, "The men in town were saying things." She waited. "About you," he said. "Word got around that father was improving. People wanted to know why. Someone from the Marsh Ranch must have said something, because by the time I got to the general store, half the county knew a housekeeper had nursed Silas back." "And?" she said. "And some of them were surprised," he said. "The way you'd expect." He looked at his bowl. "Fowler was at the store. He set a few of them straight." She looked at him. "Fowler?" "He told them he said you were the most capable woman he'd encountered in 10 years, and anyone who had a problem with how you looked could answer to him." Grant turned the spoon in his bowl. I think it surprised him as much as anyone that he said it. She was quiet for a moment. "He sent the bones," she said. "This afternoon. Hector brought them in." "I know. I saw them in the cold room." He looked at her. "Fowler doesn't say things he doesn't mean. He's not equipped for it." She understood what Grant was doing. Not apologizing again, not rehashing what had already been said, but building, adding, laying down something additional. She understood it, and she accepted it in the same practical spirit with which it was offered. "How much trouble is Reese?" she said. Grant appreciated the change of subject. She could see it, the slight ease in his posture, the move from the personal to the practical where he was more comfortable. "Potentially a lot," he said. "If he's claiming a verbal agreement, and there's nothing in writing that contradicts it, it gets complicated." He paused. "My father was meticulous about paperwork. I'd be surprised if there's nothing, but I need to find it." "Hector says Reese has been buying up smaller spreads," she said. "For 6 months, yes. Low offers, fast closings, places that are struggling." Grant's jaw worked. "The eastern pasture is our best grazing land. If he gets that, he won't," she said. Grant looked at her. "Find the documentation," she said. "Whatever your father kept, deeds, correspondence, records, go through it tomorrow morning when you're rested. The answer is there." She said it with the same certainty she'd had about the lungs, about the fever, about the broth. Not false certainty, the earned kind, the kind that comes from having paid attention to enough situations to know when the materials are there for a solution. Grant held her gaze for a moment. "You're very sure of things," he said. "When I have reason to be," she said. "And you have reason to be about this." "I have reason to believe your father did not get to 61 years and build this ranch from raw land by being careless about what he put in writing," she said. "That's not certainty, but it's enough to start from." Grant was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the table, at the empty bowl, at the cornbread he'd eaten without apparently noticing he'd eaten it. He looked like someone working through a long calculation and arriving at a number he hadn't expected. "Where did you come from?" he said. It was not quite a question, more like something that had escaped before he'd decided whether to say it. She looked at him steadily. "I told you," she said. "Denver. Before that, Colorado Springs. Before that, Nebraska." "That's not what I mean," he said. "I know," she said. She got up and took his bowl and her cup to the basin. Behind her, she heard him push back from the table, heard the small sounds of a man getting his coat off and hanging it on the door hook. "I'm going to check on father," he said. "Then the office." "In the morning," she said. "The office in the morning." A pause. "In the morning," he said. She heard his boots on the stairs, slow and heavy, with the particular weight of a tired man trying not to make noise. She heard him stop at the top of the stairs for a moment, listening, she thought, for his father's breathing, the way she did herself every time she passed that door. Then she heard him move down the hall. She washed the bowl and the cup and the pot and set them to dry. The kitchen was quiet. Through the window, the Wyoming dark pressed close and cold against the glass, and the stars were out in the way they were out on clear, cold nights. More of them than seemed possible, indifferent and brilliant. She thought about Silas, sleeping, about the coughing that morning and the afternoon, and the way his breathing had sounded at 4:30 when she'd checked him before starting the supper. Not clear yet, not fully, but different. Measurably different from 2 days ago, from yesterday, from that morning. She thought about the envelope on the kitchen table, which Grant had taken with him. About Reese's pale eyes and the way he'd looked past her at the house. About what Hector had said. Low offers, struggling spreads, the particular logic of a man who was betting on other people's disasters. She thought about the pantry, now organized. the shelves that were not full but were no longer chaotic. She thought about what Silas had said. I think she would have liked you. She turned off the kitchen lamp and went upstairs. At the door to Silas's room, she paused, listened. His breathing was slow and even, the wet catch in it softer tonight than it had been this morning. She stood in the dark hallway and listened to it for a moment, measured it against what she'd been hearing for 2 days, calibrated the difference, filed the calibration. Better. Measurably, genuinely, not just hoping better. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, and for a moment she just sat there in the dark, hands in her lap, and let herself feel something she had not allowed herself to feel since she'd arrived. Not quite relief, not yet, but the early edge of it, the beginning of permission. She had come here with a travel bag, and the knowledge Franklin had given her, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has survived enough to stop being surprised by what she could do. She had not come here expecting to stay. But the pantry was organized, and the old man's lungs were clearing, and there was a letter on Grant Mercer's kitchen table that would need an answer, and she realized, already thinking about the answer, already planning. She lay down on top of the covers, the way she had every night since she'd arrived, ready, just in case. Outside, the cold went on being cold. Inside, the house went on being warmer than it had been before she walked through the door, and that, for now, was the whole of what she needed. Grant found what he was looking for at 7:45 in the morning. She heard him on the stairs, not the slow, careful tread of a man trying not to wake the house, but the quick, purposeful descent of someone carrying something and moving with intention. She was at the stove, the elderberry tincture steeping in a small covered pot, and she turned when he came through the kitchen doorway. He had a folder of papers in his hand, not a thin folder, a thick one, the kind that accumulates over years of careful record-keeping. He set it on the kitchen table and spread the top layer out. There, he said. She came to the table and looked. The document on top was a deed record. She could see that immediately, the formal lettering, the official stamps. And beneath it was a handwritten letter in a cramped, precise hand that she recognized after a moment as Silas's. And beneath that were 2 more documents with the letterhead of something that looked like a territorial land office. What am I looking at? She said. The Eastern Pasture, Grant said. My father bought it in 1871, outright, no encumbrances, no agreements, nothing held in reserve. The deed is unambiguous, he pointed to the top document. And this, he pulled out the handwritten letter, is a letter my father wrote to the land office in 1881, specifically documenting that no verbal or written agreements regarding the Eastern Pasture existed with any third party. He wrote it without prompting, just had it notarized and filed it. She looked at him. Why would he do that unprompted? Because someone tried something similar with a neighbor of ours in 1880, Grant said. A man named Reese made a claim on a verbal agreement regarding some land east of the Fowler Spread. The neighbor couldn't disprove it. He sold rather than fight. He tapped the letter. My father saw it happen and made records, preemptively. He paused. He knew. She looked at the document. At the notary stamp, the date, the precise documentation of a man who understood that the world sometimes required you to prove a negative. Your father anticipated this, she said. A year before Reese ever wrote to him, Grant said. He sat down heavily in the chair. He knew what Reese was doing, and he protected himself, and he never said a word to me about it. She pulled out the chair across from him and sat. Why didn't he tell you? Grant was quiet for a moment. He turned one of the papers over in his hands. Because he didn't want me to worry, he said. Because he handles things and then files them away and expects the world to move on. He put the paper down. Because he's Silas Mercer, and he's been managing problems alone for 40 years and hasn't entirely figured out that I'm an adult. It was more than he'd said about his father in one stretch since she'd arrived, and she understood it was not a complaint. It was something closer to a complicated love, the kind that accumulates between people who are too similar to live easily together and too bonded to live apart. Take those upstairs and show him, she said. He should know you found them. He already knows they're there, Grant said. I know, she said. Show him anyway. He looked at her. He picked up the folder. She heard their voices through the ceiling for a long time. Not arguing, the voices didn't have that shape. Something else. The low back and forth of two men covering ground they'd been circling for years, using the occasion of papers and a land dispute as a kind of cover for something older. She recognized it. She and Franklin had done it too, used the practical thing, the immediate thing, as the vehicle for the conversation underneath the practical thing, because some conversations were easier when you had something else to look at. She got on with the elderberry tincture and checked the morning broth and put the dried apples to soak for the afternoon, and she let them have their time. When Grant came back down, he looked lighter. Not fixed. There was nothing simple enough about any of this to be fixed in one morning, but fractionally lighter in the way that people look after something that's been held in, has been let out a little. He said to tell you he wants the beef stew tomorrow, Grant said. He's not ready for beef stew tomorrow, she said. I know, I told him. He said you'd say that. Grant poured himself coffee. He also said to ask you if you're planning to stay. She looked up from the pot. He didn't want to ask you directly, Grant said. He said you'd give him an honest answer, but he wanted to give you time to think about it first, so he sent me to ask. He held the coffee cup in both hands. So I'm asking. She looked at the pot, at the organized pantry through the doorway, at the kitchen that had become, over the past 3 days, something that functioned, not perfectly, nothing here was going to be perfect, but genuinely practically functioned. Yes, she said. Grant nodded. He drank his coffee. Outside, she heard Hector and Dawes in the yard, and the particular sound of morning work resuming, the routine of a ranch that had been holding its breath for 2 weeks and was now cautiously exhaling. There's something else, Grant said. She waited. Reese is coming back, he said. He sent word through someone in Carvel. He's coming Friday, when he expects my father to still be too sick to deal with him directly, and he's bringing someone from the land office. He set the cup down. I think he's planning to push the claim in person. Then your father needs to be well enough to be in the room, she said. Grant looked at her. It's 4 days. I know, she said. We'll see. The next 2 days had their own rhythm. Silas improved in the way of someone who has been very ill and is now genuinely, stubbornly recovering. Not smoothly, not in a straight line, but with the unmistakable forward momentum of a body that has turned a corner and is not going back. He had one more significant coughing episode on the second morning, and it was the last one. What came up was minimal, the fluid nearly resolved, and afterward his breathing was the clearest it had been since before the fever started. By the afternoon of the third day, he was sitting up for several hours at a stretch, demanding more substantial food, and complaining about being confined to the bedroom, which Abigail took as the most reliable sign of genuine recovery she'd seen yet. The complaining is good, she told Grant, who was not finding it entirely good. He's asked me 4 times when Reese is coming, Grant said. What did you tell him? Friday. He looked at the ceiling. He said good. She did not find that entirely comfortable either, if she was honest with herself. Silas's recovery was real, but 4 days was not 6 weeks, and the particular fire she'd been watching build in the old man's eyes every time Reese was mentioned had the quality of a man planning to do more than just present documents. On Thursday morning, she went upstairs to find Silas standing at the window, not holding the window frame, not leaning on anything, standing, with the slightly careful posture of someone who is checking their own structural integrity as they go, but standing on his own in the morning light. She stopped in the doorway. He heard her and turned. He looked, at that moment, less like the man she'd been nursing and more like the man the ranch hands had been describing. Not back to what he'd been 3 weeks ago, not yet. There were hollows in his face that weren't going to fill in overnight, but present. Fundamentally, recognizably present. I walked to the window, he said. I can see that, she said. How do your legs feel? Like I've been in bed for 2 weeks, he said. Which I have. He turned back to the window. Outside, the yard was visible, the barn and the outbuildings, and the frozen expanse of the Blackstone pastures under a winter sky going pale at the edges. He looked at it for a long moment. I couldn't see the yard from the bed, he said. I missed the yard. She understood that in a way she could not have fully explained. The view out of a window, for a person who has been sick and confined and uncertain, it was not a small thing. She came to stand beside him, not too close, both of them looking at the yard. Dawes was splitting wood by the barn. Hector was coming from the direction of the cattle pens, moving fast, his breath showing white in the cold. You need to not overdo it before tomorrow, she said. I'm standing at a window, Silas said. You're standing at a window now, she said. And then you'll try to walk the hall, and then you'll want to come downstairs, and then you'll be angry that your legs won't do what you're telling them to do, and you'll push harder than you should. She looked at him. I've watched you for 4 days. I know how you approach things. He was quiet for a moment. That obvious? To someone paying attention. He almost smiled. It was becoming a more frequent thing, that almost smile, that quality of warmth that he kept close and didn't distribute freely, but that, when it appeared, changed the whole character of his face. Fine, he said. I'll come down for supper and save the rest for tomorrow. Lunch, she said. You can come down for lunch. Supper is still upstairs. Lunch, he said, with the resignation of a man who knows which battles he's going to win. She left him at the window and went to tell Grant that his father would be at the table at noon. Grant's response was to stand very still for a moment and then say, quietly, "All right," in the voice of a man who has been carrying something heavy and has just been told, for the first time, that he might be able to set it down. She made the beef stew for lunch. Not because he was fully ready for it, she still thought soup was the more sensible choice, medically, but because she had observed, over the past 4 days, that Silas Mercer's recovery was as much about will as it was about physiology, and sometimes the right medicine was the thing the patient had decided they needed, delivered at the right moment. She made it carefully, cut the beef into smaller pieces than normal, cooked it longer, kept the broth base light. Vegetables soft. Nothing that would challenge a stomach still finding its way back. It was beef stew in spirit more than in substance, but the spirit was what mattered. Silas came down the stairs at noon with Grant beside him, not holding him up, just positioned beside him, the careful proximity of someone ready to catch rather than support. And he came into the kitchen and sat down at the table and looked at the bowl she put in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment. She sat down across the table with her own bowl. Hector and Presley were at the far end of the table, and Dawes was there too, and nobody said anything because everybody understood that this was a moment that didn't need commentary. Silas picked up the spoon. He ate. He ate slowly, and he only finished about 2/3 of the bowl before he put the spoon down, and she could see the effort that even that much had cost him. A slight pale around his mouth, the careful way he breathed when he set the spoon down. But his eyes, when he looked up, were steady and clear, and something in them that had been absent since she'd arrived. That, he said, is good. Hector made a sound. Presley grinned. Dawes looked at the table and then back up at Silas, and something passed across his young face that she thought might have been the expression of a person who has recently been wrong about something important and is in the process of rearranging himself around that fact. Grant said nothing. He was eating his own stew, but his jaw had the particular set of a man holding himself in, and she understood that he was holding in something that would have embarrassed him to show in a room full of people. She understood that too. Callum Reese arrived at 10 in the morning on Friday. He came with 2 men this time, not the same 2 as before, and she noted that. The first visit had been outriders, functional. These were different. One was well-dressed in the way of a legal professional, carrying a leather case. The other was broader, quieter, wearing the particular kind of neutral expression that took practice to maintain. She opened the door before they knocked. Reese looked at her and then, automatically, passed her. And then he stopped, because the room visible behind her was not an empty house with a sick man upstairs. Silas Mercer was sitting in the chair by the fireplace in the front room, fully dressed, and Grant was standing to the right of the fireplace, and Hector was by the window, and the room was not set up like a sick room. It was set up like a meeting. Something shifted in Reese's pale eyes. "Mr. Mercer," he said, addressing himself toward the room, covering his surprise quickly. He was good at covering things. "I heard you'd been unwell. I'm glad to see you on your feet." "I'm not on my feet," Silas said. "I'm in a chair. Come in." Reese came in, and the legal professional came in, and the third man stayed on the porch without being told to, which told Abigail something about how Reese operated. She closed the door and stood near it, partly because there was nowhere obvious else to stand, and partly because she wanted to see Reese's face when he had to conduct his business with all of these people in the room. The legal professional, a thin man with a precise mustache who introduced himself as Hartley, opened his leather case on the side table and produced a document that he held with the careful reverence people extend to papers they believe are going to accomplish something. "Mr. Mercer," Hartley said, We've corresponded about the matter of the eastern pasture. Mr. Reese has documentation of your verbal agreement from the spring of 1881, witnessed by— I made no such agreement, Silas said. His voice was not loud. It was not heated. It was the voice of a man who has said a simple true thing and is prepared to go on saying it as many times as necessary. Hartley paused, glanced at Reese. Our documentation indicates— I'm aware of what your documentation indicates, Silas said. I've read your letters. He looked at Reese directly. I've been in this territory for 30 years, Reese. I've watched you work. I know what you do, and I know how you do it. Reese held the eye contact. He was good at that, she noted, the kind of man who had learned that holding someone's gaze was itself a form of pressure. Silas, we've known each other for years. I'm not looking for a conflict here. The agreement was informal. I understand that, but— Grant, Silas said. Grant stepped forward and placed the folder on the side table beside Hartley's document. The notarized letter was on top. Hartley picked it up. He read it. She watched his face while he read it, the way she had watched Grant's face, and she saw the same sequence: reading, then recalibration, then something that was not quite the expression she'd expected from a legal professional presenting a fraudulent claim. It was something more complicated, more uncomfortable, the expression of a man who had not known the full picture he was operating in. This was filed with the Territorial Land Office, Grant said, in October of 1881. 2 months before the date Reese claims the verbal agreement occurred. He looked at Reese. My father documented the absence of any agreements before the claim could be made. Reese said nothing for a long moment. He looked at Silas. Silas looked back at him with the steady, unhurried patience of someone who has all the time in the world and knows it. The timing, Reese started. The timing is not ambiguous, Silas said, and you know it. Hartley was still looking at the notarized letter. His case was on the table, and he had the posture of a man who is reassessing his position with some urgency. Mr. Reese, he said quietly, I was not shown this document before today. Reese looked at the legal professional. Something passed between them, brief, specific, the compressed communication of people on the same side of a table who have just discovered they are not working from the same information. Then Reese looked at the letter and then at Silas, and something in his face shifted. It was not, she thought, the collapse of a man caught in a lie. It was something more controlled than that, the controlled retreat of someone who has encountered an obstacle and is already mentally rerouting. He was not going to make a scene. Men like Reese never made scenes. Scenes were for people who had already lost. I may have misremembered the specifics of our conversation, Reese said. The room was very quiet. You may have, Silas said. I'll have Hartley review the documentation more thoroughly. Reese picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the arm of the chair. I apologize for the intrusion. He said it the way he said everything, smoothly, with the surface presentation of a reasonable man. He looked at Grant, then at Silas, and then, for a brief moment, at Abigail by the door. His eyes stayed on her for just a second longer than necessary. She could not have said exactly what was in that look. Not the contempt of a beaten man, not quite, something more thoughtful. The look of a man filing information away. She opened the front door for him. He walked out, and Hartley followed with his leather case, and she closed the door. The room was very still. Then Hector, by the window, exhaled in a long, controlled breath. Presley, who had been a silent presence in the hallway the whole time, made a sound that might have been a word. Grant set his hands flat on the side table and looked down at them. Silas looked at the fire. Well, he said, that's that. For now, Grant said. For now, Silas agreed. He looked at Grant with the eyes of a man who has just watched his son handle something well and is working out how to say so without making it strange. You found the file. She told me where to look, Grant said. He did not look at Abigail when he said it. Silas looked at her. She was still standing near the door. No, she didn't, Silas said. She told you to look. That's different. Grant turned that over. He looked at the floor and then at his father and then, briefly, at her. Yes, he said, Ed. That's right. She did not say anything. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on because the morning had been tense and cold, and everyone in that room needed something warm, and that was her job. Cecilia Marsh came in the afternoon, as she'd said she would. She arrived to find Silas in the kitchen, drinking the tea Abigail had made and arguing with Grant about whether he was going to rest that afternoon or whether he was going to look at the cattle ledgers, and she stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking in the whole scene before anyone noticed her. When Silas saw her, he straightened in his chair with the instinctive pride of a man who does not want to look like he's been sick in front of people. "Cecilia." "Silas Mercer," she said, "you look like something that fell out of a tree and hit every branch." "I feel considerably better than that," he said. "You look considerably better than you did a week ago," she said. She looked at Abigail. "She told me you'd be past the worst of it by now. She was right." "She was right about several things," Silas said, with the particular tone of a man making a general statement that carries specific weight. Cecilia sat down at the table with the ease of someone who has been sitting at this table for 20 years, and Abigail poured her tea and poured herself a cup and sat down too, and Grant took the cattle ledger he'd been angling toward and made himself scarce in the way of a man who understands that some conversations are not for him. "Tell me about Reese," Cecilia said, looking at Abigail. Abigail told her. Cecilia listened the way she did everything, with complete focused attention, her long fingers wrapped around the teacup, her face still and assessing. When Abigail finished, Cecilia was quiet for a moment. "He's not going to stop," Cecilia said. "Not entirely. He may leave the eastern pasture alone. He doesn't have anything to work with there now, but he'll look for another way in." "I know," Abigail said. "He doesn't like losing," Silas said. "Most people don't," Abigail said. Cecilia looked at her. "How long have you been here?" 5 days. Cecilia considered this. 5 days, she said. "You pulled Silas back from what I was fairly certain was his deathbed, organized his household, and saw off a land claim." She looked at Silas. "Where has she been?" "Denver," Silas said. "Before that, Colorado Springs. Before that, Nebraska," Abigail said. Cecilia looked at her steadily. She had the eyes of a woman who has seen a great deal and has long since stopped being surprised by most of it. "You should know," she said, "that what you've done here is already being talked about. Not the Reese business. Grant and Silas can handle the telling of that. The other thing." "The other thing," Abigail said. "Silas was sick, and now he's not," Cecilia said. "In this kind of country that travels, and the how of it travels." She looked down at her tea. "Ruth told everyone in her church circle. Fowler told anyone who came within earshot at the general store." She paused. "There are people saying things that are not kind about it." "About my size," Abigail said. "Yes. There are always people saying things," Abigail said. "I've never found it useful to structure my life around them." Cecilia smiled. It was not a thing she appeared to do easily or often, but when it came it was real, a genuine, direct, unguarded thing. "No," she said. "I've never found it useful either." She picked up her tea. "There are also people saying things that are quite different in character." "I've heard some of those too," Abigail said. "You'll hear more," Cecilia said. They sat with that for a moment, the particular comfortable quiet of two women who have both spent their lives doing the work and letting the talk sort itself out. Silas looked at the window. "She's staying," he said. He said it the way he said most things, as a statement of existing fact rather than an announcement. Cecilia looked at Abigail. "Good," she said. It was Dawes who surprised her, the evening of the 5th day. She was alone in the kitchen after supper. Grant had taken Silas upstairs. Hector and Presley had gone to the bunkhouse, and she was washing the dishes in the particular quiet of an empty kitchen at the end of a long day, when she heard boots at the back door and looked up to find Dawes standing there. He was 23 years old, and he had a face that didn't quite know yet what kind of face it was going to settle into, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at the floor and then at her and then at the floor again. "I said something," he said, "the first night, when you were cooking." She looked at him. "I know you heard it," he said. I was stupid about it. I said something stupid, and I heard you hear it, and I didn't—" He stopped, started again. "I wanted to say I was sorry before I said it so many times in my head that saying it out loud got harder." She set the dish down and looked at him properly. He was genuinely uncomfortable, not the discomfort of someone performing contrition, but the real physical discomfort of a young person who has been carrying something they don't know how to put down. He was gripping the brim of his hat with both hands, and he had the look of someone who has rehearsed this, and is now discovering that the rehearsed version and the real version are different. "What you said was unkind," she said, "and it was the kind of unkind thing that people say because they've been taught to, not because they actually thought it through, which doesn't make it all right, but it does mean something about where it came from." Dawes looked at her. "You kept the broth going," she said. "That night. You didn't have to do that. That was not just anything," she said. "Silas Mercer is alive in part because that broth kept going through the night and the morning. I was asleep. You kept it going." She looked at him steadily. "I don't think less of someone for what they say at the beginning when they don't know yet. I think about what they do once they know." He stood very still for a moment. "All right," he said. His voice was younger than he usually let it sound. "All right," she said. He left. She heard his boots on the frozen ground going toward the bunkhouse, and she stood at the basin for a moment with the clean dish in her hands. This too, she thought, was part of the job. Not the part anyone wrote down when they posted advertisements for housekeepers, but present in it, woven through it the way the bones were woven into the broth, the invisible structural element that made everything else hold together. She put the dish on the rack and picked up the next one. On the 6th day, Grant asked if she would look at the cattle ledgers. He did not approach it directly. He came into the kitchen in the morning with the ledger under his arm and set it on the table and poured himself coffee and stood there for a moment before he said, as if it were incidental, "The records from last autumn are a mess. Darla was keeping them, and she didn't know what she was doing." She looked at him. "You want me to look at them?" "I want a second set of eyes," he said. "If you're willing." She took the ledger. She sat down with it in her coffee and went through it while he stood at the window. And it was indeed a mess. Inconsistent recording, numbers entered in the wrong columns, gaps where there should have been entries. But underneath the mess, the actual information was present, just improperly organized, and she worked through it methodically, finding the real numbers inside the confused ones, noting what was missing. She took an hour. When she finished, she put the ledger back on the table and looked at Grant. "Your cattle losses last fall were lower than these records make them look," she said. "About 30% lower. Whoever was entering these was confusing head counts with weight records." She turned to a page she'd marked. "And there are 6 weeks of feed costs missing. If you need to reconstruct them, Hector will likely remember. He's the kind of man who tracks things without realizing he's doing it." Grant looked at the page she'd turned to. He looked at her. "You read ledgers," he said. "My father kept books for a general store," she said. "I learned to read them before I was 10. She closed the ledger. "You should hire someone to keep them going forward, properly." "I'm looking at someone," he said. She looked at him steadily. "If you're willing," he said. It was a word he'd apparently learned from the morning's exchange and found useful. There was something slightly careful about his voice when he said it. Not humble. Grant Mercer was not made for humility as a consistent condition, but the practiced care of a man who has recently and repeatedly discovered that he doesn't have the full picture and has decided to approach things slightly more slowly. "I'm a housekeeper," she said. "You're whatever this ranch needs," he said. "That's not me expanding your duties without your agreement. That's me asking what you want to take on." She looked at the ledger, at the kitchen, at the organized pantry through the doorway. She thought about Silas in the chair by the fire last night, color in his face, discussing the spring cattle plans with Grant in the way of a man re-entering his own life. She thought about the eastern pasture and the notarized letter and Reese's pale eyes in the doorway. "One thing at a time," she said. "The house first. The ledgers are secondary." "Agreed," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the expression she'd been watching develop over 6 days. Not the single thing it had started as, that dismissive sweep at the door, but something layered and revising itself continuously. She did not know yet what it would settle into. She was not sure he did either. "Your father told me about your mother," she said. He went still. "He didn't say much," she said, "just that she liked plain people, that she said it was easier to trust them." She looked at the ledger. "I thought you should know he told me." Grant was quiet for a long moment. When she glanced at him, his face had the private, slightly unguarded look of someone hearing a thing they needed to hear and were not prepared for. He looked at the window, at the yard, at the cattle pens in the cold morning. "She would have liked you," he said. It was what Silas had said. She did not point that out. She picked up the ledger and set it on the shelf by the pantry door, where it could be found again easily when they were ready for it. "I'm making soup for lunch," she said. "Beef broth, proper this time, with the bones Fowler sent. Tell your father he's having soup, not stew, and if he argues, tell him I said the stew is for Sunday." Grant almost smiled. It was the closest thing she'd seen from him to Silas's almost smile, and it had the same quality, held close, not freely given, but real when it appeared. "I'll tell him," he said. He took his coat off the hook and went out to the yard. She stood at the stove and looked at the kitchen around her. The shelved pantry, the organized workspace, the pot on the stove that smelled already of bone broth and the promise of the afternoon meal, the window with its view of the frozen black stone pastures going white and still under the winter sky. She had arrived 6 days ago with a travel bag and a dead husband's knowledge, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had run out of places where she was somebody's widow and needed, with some urgency, to be somewhere she was only herself. She was not there yet. These things took time, but the pantry was full, and the old man was out of danger, and the eastern pasture was still Mercer land, and the kitchen smelled like something worth coming home to. That, for now, was enough to work with. Sunday came with actual sunlight, not the pale, non-committal light that had been passing for daylight all week. Real sunlight, the kind that came off the snow with enough force to make you squint, turning the frozen blackstone pastures into something that looked almost hospitable. Abigail noticed it first from the kitchen window while she was starting the morning fire, and she stood there for a moment with the match in her hand and let herself look at it. 6 days of gray. 1 morning of sun. It was not a resolution. The cold was still there, the road was still frozen, the cattle still needed tending, and the ledgers still needed fixing, and Reese was still out there somewhere recalculating his approach. But the sun was on the snow, and it was Sunday, and she had promised Silas beef stew. She put the match to the kindling and got to work. By the time the household was moving, boots on stairs, the smell of coffee pulling people toward the kitchen the way it always did, she had the stew started. Proper this time, the last of Fowler's bones had gone into a long broth overnight, and now the actual beef was in, cut correctly, with the carrots she'd found in the cold room that she hadn't known were there until Hector mentioned them on Thursday. Onions, the last of the dried sage. A patience with the heat that she'd learned from Franklin, who had believed that most cooking problems were really just impatience problems in disguise. Silas came downstairs on his own. She heard him on the stairs and turned to watch, because she was still watching, still calibrating, still doing the constant background assessment that she would probably not fully stop doing until he had been well for a solid week. And what she saw was a man descending stairs the way he used to descend them, before. Not tentatively, not with one hand braced on the wall, walking down his own staircase in his own house like it belonged to him. He came into the kitchen and looked at the pot. "That's the stew," he said. "That's the stew," she said. He sat down at the table and she poured his coffee, and he wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the window and the sunlight coming through it, and he did not say anything for a long moment, and she did not require him to. Grant came in behind him, and Hector, and Dawes and Presley from the back, and the kitchen filled up the way it had been filling up all week, not the careful, subdued filling of a house holding its breath around a sick man, but the ordinary, slightly chaotic filling of people who have somewhere to be and something to eat, and enough warmth to not be thinking about either of those things very hard. It was ordinary. She had been working toward ordinary for 6 days without quite naming it that. And now it was here, and it felt, as ordinary things often do when they've been absent for a while, like something remarkable. Suck. After breakfast, Silas asked her to walk with him. Not far. He was not ready for far, and he knew it, which she appreciated. Just to the end of the porch and back, in the sunlight, with the cold air and the view of the yard and the distant pastures. She put on her coat and walked beside him, close enough to catch him if he needed it, and far enough away that he didn't have to think about that. He walked slowly. The porch was perhaps 30 feet, end to end. He went the full length and stopped at the railing and put his hands on it and looked out. "I can see the eastern pasture from here," he said. "I know," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "When I was sick, the worst of it, I kept thinking about that pasture." He looked at the white expanse of it, the fence line visible at the edge. 40 years of work is in that land. My father's work, and then mine. He paused. It sounds like a foolish thing to be thinking about when you're dying. It doesn't sound foolish at all, she said. He looked at her sideways. No? You weren't thinking about the land, she said. You were thinking about what the land represents, what you built, whether it would still be standing after you. She looked at the pasture, too. That's not foolish. That's the most human thing there is. He was quiet for a long moment. The cold off the snow was sharp and clean, and somewhere in the direction of the barn, a horse made a sound, and Dawes's voice answered it, and the ordinary sounds of the working morning continued without requiring anything from either of them. Grant is better than he thinks he is, Silas said. She waited. He's got things in him that don't show easily, Silas said. His mother's way of seeing people. The real version of it, when he lets it operate. He had it when he was young, and then Clara died, and he put it away somewhere. He was talking about his wife the way people talk about the dead, when they've had enough time with the loss to carry it without drama. Present, matter of fact, still waited. These past days I've been watching him. He's been watching you, she said. He's been watching you, Silas said, which is not the same thing, but is related. He turned from the railing. I'm going to say something plainly because I'm too old and recently too sick to bother with the long way around it. She looked at him. You came here to be somewhere you were only yourself, he said. You told me that. I heard it. He met her eyes. You are. Here. Whatever comes next. He paused. This is the place, if you want it. She held his gaze. It was a plain thing, the way he always said things, and it landed the way plain things land, without softening, directly in the place it was aimed at. I know, she said. He nodded. He turned toward the door. She opened it for him, and they went back inside. The stew was ready at noon, and it was, she thought, the best thing she'd made since arriving, not because the ingredients were exceptional. They weren't. They were the same frontier staples she'd been working with all week, good quality now that Grant had resupplied, but nothing remarkable. It was because she'd had time with the kitchen. She knew the stove's temperament now, the way it ran hot on the left side and needed watching. She knew where everything was. She knew who was eating and what they'd been through and what they needed, which was not a small kind of knowledge. Silas ate a full bowl and asked for more. She gave him more because his stomach had been handling things well for 2 days, and because he'd walked the porch in the cold this morning, and because there were limits to how long a recovering man could reasonably be held to invalid food before the restriction itself became a problem. He ate the second helping with the focused appreciation of a man rediscovering something he'd taken for granted. Nobody talked much at the table, so the particular comfortable quiet of people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. Presley ate 3 bowls. Dawes asked, with the careful tone of someone not sure of the reception, if there was any left for tomorrow. Make your own tomorrow, Hector told him. I can't cook, Dawes said. Then you'll be eating cold cornbread. Dawes looked at Abigail. She looked at Dawes. I'll teach you to make a basic stew, she said. Not today. Some afternoon this week when the kitchen's clear. His face did the thing it had been doing more frequently since Thursday evening, that slightly startled openness of someone being treated decently by someone they'd wronged, which was a particular flavor of surprise that Abigail had some experience with and did not find unpleasant. Yeah, he said. All right, thanks. Grant, across the table, looked at his bowl and did not say anything, but she saw the small private adjustment of his expression. It was Cecilia who brought word of what was being said. She came Wednesday. Not the planned visit, the other kind, the kind where a woman shows up because she has news and couldn't wait until the scheduled time. She came in the front door and accepted coffee and sat across from Abigail at the kitchen table with a directness that meant she'd been rehearsing the opening. Fowler gave a speech, she said. Abigail set down her cup. What kind of speech? The kind Fowler gives when he's been stewing on something for a week and it finally comes out all at once, Cecilia said. He was at the general store in Carvel on Monday, and apparently there were men there talking about the Blackstone, about Silas. And some of what they were saying was about you. She looked at her coffee. Some of it was not charitable. I've heard uncharitable things before, Abigail said. I know you have, Cecilia said. That's not why I'm telling you. I'm telling you because of what happened after. She looked up. Fowler stood up, which for Fowler means actually stood up, which he rarely does in public. And he said that he'd been in this territory 22 years and he had seen men with good horses and fine coats, and the right kind of face accomplish a great deal less than what that woman did in this county last week. He said he'd sent her bones because she asked for them practically, and he liked a person who was practical, and that if any man in that store had a problem with how she looked, they were welcome to explain their problem to him outside. She paused. There was apparently a significant silence. Abigail was quiet for a moment. Nobody went outside, Cecilia said. No, Abigail said. I imagine they didn't. Cecilia looked at her steadily. The men who were saying unkind things before Monday are not saying them now, not in public. She picked up her coffee. That's not nothing. No, Abigail said. It's not nothing. She thought about Fowler, the sheepskin coat that had seen better days, the squinting outdoor face, the uncomfortable moment in the kitchen when he'd said the wrong thing and then offered bones. She thought about the particular way that some people's decency operated, quietly for a long time, and then all at once, loudly, when something finally pushed it to the surface. Franklin had been like that. Not the loud part, but the all-at-once part. He had believed things deeply and privately, and then, when pressed, stated them without apology and at full volume, and she had found it one of the most reliable things about him. She missed it. She missed him. Less sharply than she had 2 years ago, more permanently than she'd expected at the time. Grief had a way of settling in for the long term, not as a constant pain, but as a constant presence, the negative space of someone's absence in the shape of all the places they used to be. You're thinking about your husband, Cecilia said. She looked at the older woman. How did you know? Because I've been thinking about mine every day for 8 years, and I recognize the look, Cecilia said simply. It changes, but it doesn't leave. They sat with that for a moment. Two women who had lost something significant and kept moving, which was not the same as having recovered from it. He would have liked it here, Abigail said. Franklin. He'd have found the terrain interesting and spent 2 days cataloging the medicinal plants in the area, and then got into a debate with Dr. Aldrin about something technical. She almost smiled. He liked debates. Was he good at them? Terrible, she said. He was right most of the time, but he was terrible at the arguing of it. He'd get frustrated and go quiet when he should have pressed the point. She looked at the window. I learned to argue the points for him. He'd start something and I'd finish it. Cecilia looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. You must have been extraordinary together, she said. We were ordinary together, Abigail said. Ordinary is extraordinary when you have it. Most people don't understand that until it's gone. It was late February when Reese made his second approach. Not in person this time. A letter, arriving through the Carvel post, addressed to Silas and Grant jointly, a more careful construction than the previous correspondence, the kind of thing put together by a man who has had time to reconsider and has hired someone better than Hartley to do the reconsidering. Grant brought it to the kitchen table and read it aloud while Abigail finished the breakfast dishes, and Silas sat with his second cup of coffee and his steadily improving color. The letter was not a claim this time. It was an offer, a purchase offer, for the eastern pasture specifically, at a price Grant said was approximately 40% of what the land was worth. He knows we know his claim won't hold, Grant said, setting the letter down. So now he's trying to buy it. At 40%, Silas said. At 40%, Grant confirmed. Silas looked at his coffee. He looked at the window. He looked at Abigail, who was setting the last of the dishes on the rack and had her back to them. What do you think? He said. She turned around. I think he's not finished, she said. I think 40% is an opener, not an offer. I think he expects to negotiate and ends up somewhere around 60, 65, and that's what he actually wants to pay. She dried her hands on the towel. I also think that the eastern pasture is worth more than he's ever going to offer, and that its value is going to increase as the territory develops, and that selling any part of it to Callum Reese at any price is something you will regret within 5 years. Silas looked at Grant. Grant looked at the letter. She's right, he said. It came out without hesitation, which was its own kind of thing. The 6 weeks between the morning at the door and this morning in the kitchen, the distance between those two versions of how he talked about her. Then we write back and decline, Silas said. I'll draft it, Grant said. Let her look at it before you send it, Silas said. Grant looked at his father, then at Abigail. He did not argue. Fine, he said. She looked at the two of them. The older man with his mended health and his direct eyes. The younger one with his slow-developing openness and his father's intelligence operating now less defensively than it had been. And she thought about what it meant to be in a room where her opinion was asked for and expected and treated as a variable in the actual outcome. It had been a long time since she had been in such a room. Franklin's rooms had been like that. His office, their kitchen in Denver, the examining room in the camps where she'd worked beside him. She had not fully understood, until those rooms were gone, how much of herself had lived in them. "I'll look at it," she said. The letter went out on Thursday. By the following Tuesday, they had a response, brief, neutral in tone, acknowledging the decline of the offer. No further correspondence came after that. Abigail did not believe Reese was finished. She stood by what she'd said, that he was not a man who stopped. He was a man who recalculated. But she understood that recalculation took time, and in that time the Blackstone would keep running, and Silas would keep recovering, and the eastern pasture would keep being what it was. Solid Mercer land with good grass and a deed that had no ambiguities and a notarized letter in a file that said so. Some things you could not fix permanently. You could only fix them for now, and then be ready for the next version of the problem, and have enough of yourself intact to handle it when it came. That was not cynicism. That was the most honest thing she knew. Spring came the way Wyoming spring always comes, not gradually, not gracefully, but in lurches. A week of cold, then 3 warm days that felt almost like a promise, then cold again. Then one morning you walked outside and the mud was there, and the mud meant the ground was thinking about thawing, and the thinking about it was already a kind of commitment. The mud morning was in mid-March. Silas came downstairs that morning and stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "Spring," the way a man says a word he's been waiting to say for a long time. "Mud," Abigail said from the stove. "Same thing," he said. He was fully himself by then, not the himself of before the fever. That version had some edges knocked off it now. A slight deliberateness in how he moved, a somewhat shorter day before he was tired. Things he'd had to accept, and was accepting with more grace than she'd expected. But himself, occupying his house and his land and his days with the complete settled presence of a man who belongs where he is. She had watched it come back in pieces, and she had thought, watching it, that recovery was a strange kind of proof. Not proof of medicine or nursing or the value of a good broth. All of those had mattered, she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But proof of something prior to all of those things. The fact that Silas Mercer had wanted to come back. Had fought toward the light because the life waiting on the other side of the fever was a life worth fighting toward. You could not nurse a person who had decided not to be nursed. She had seen that too, in Franklin's work and in her own. The ones who had stopped wanting things. They went a different way regardless of what you did. The care only worked when there was something in the patient reaching toward it. Silas had been reaching the whole time. She had just given him something to reach toward. That mattered. What she'd done mattered. She was not going to diminish it. But it was not the whole story, and she knew it, and knowing it felt important. Grant found her in the garden on the first real spring afternoon. Not a garden yet, a patch of ground on the south side of the house that she had been looking at since February, calculating the sun exposure and the drainage, thinking about what could grow there given the elevation and the season length. She had a stick in her hand and was marking out a rough boundary in the softening mud, nothing formal, just thinking through it physically the way she did with problems she was still developing. He came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her. She looked up. He looked at the stick in her hand and at the line she'd been drawing and at her mud-covered boots. "Kitchen garden," she said, before he asked. "All right," he said. "I'll need seeds. Some can come from Cecilia. She said she saves hers. Others I'll need from Carvel." She looked at the ground. "By summer there'll be enough to supplement the pantry considerably. Onions, kitchen herbs, some root vegetables. Possibly squash if the season cooperates." He was quiet for a moment. She looked at him and found him looking at her with the expression that had been developing all winter. Still not fully formed, still revising, but more settled than it had been, less defended. "My mother had a kitchen garden," he said. "Your father mentioned it," she said. "Not directly. He said she liked plain people and useful things. A kitchen garden sounded like her kind of thing." He looked at the rough lines in the mud. "She grew tomatoes," he said. "I don't know how. The season's barely long enough, but she grew them every year. He paused. She'd put them on everything. I'll try tomatoes, she said. He looked at her then, directly, the way he'd been learning to, without the protective screening he'd had that first day. Why? He said. Because it's worth trying, she said. Some years they won't take, some years they will. The trying doesn't cost much, and the having of them costs even less. He stood there for a moment. The spring afternoon was going gold at the edges, the way afternoons do in March in Wyoming when the light comes in low. Everything caught in it looking more itself than usual, more present. The mud and the bare ground in the south wall of the house, and Grant Mercer standing in his coat with his hands in his pockets, looking like the beginning of something that neither of them was ready to name yet. I was wrong about you, he said. Again. The same 5 words as the kitchen, weeks ago. You said that, she said. I know, he said. I wanted to say it again, because I mean it more now than I did then. He paused. At the beginning I said it because the evidence required it. Now I'm saying it because I understand it. That's different. She looked at him. He held the look without flinching. Yes, she said. It is. She pressed the stick into the ground at the corner of where the tomatoes would go, if the season cooperated, and she walked the rough perimeter of the garden she was already building in her head, and Grant stood at the edge of it and watched her work. The thing about misjudgment is that it is almost never singular. Abigail had spent enough years being misjudged to understand that it was not, at its root, about her. It was about the limits of whoever was doing the judging, the edges of their experience, the shortcuts their minds took when confronted with a person who didn't fit the expected shape. Grant Mercer had not been a cruel man or an especially ignorant one. He was an ordinary man with ordinary blind spots, shaped by the world he'd grown up in, making the assessments that world had taught him to make. She had known men far worse. She had known men who would not have revised their assessment regardless of the evidence. She had watched Dawes, who was younger and in some ways less equipped than Grant, revise his faster, because youth sometimes has a flexibility that competence can calcify away, and Dawes had not yet built enough certainty about the world to be too attached to any particular version of it. These things did not make her angry anymore. She had been angry, once, for a long time. The anger had its purpose. It had kept her moving when moving was hard, had kept her from accepting treatment she did not deserve. But anger as a permanent condition cost more than it returned, and she had put it down somewhere in the years after Franklin died, and had not missed it as much as she'd expected to. What she had instead was something less dramatic and more durable. The knowledge that she was good at what she did, that she knew things that mattered, that the world's opinion of her body had never once made her hands less steady at the critical moment. She had carried that through Nebraska and Colorado Springs and Denver, and through a travel bag on a frozen January road to a ranch where she was not wanted, and she had put it to work, and it had held. That was the whole of the lesson. There was no elegant version of it, no tidy summation. It was just, she had known what she was worth, and she had gone ahead and been worth it, and eventually the world around her had caught up. Some of it had caught up faster than she'd expected. Some of it, she understood, was still catching up. That was all right. She had time. By April, the Blackstone Ranch was running the way it was supposed to run. The cattle had come through the winter better than the numbers suggested they should have. Hector thought it was the feed rotation he'd adjusted in February, and he was probably right, and she had said so. And Hector had looked pleased in the careful way of a man who is not used to being told he's right. The kitchen garden had its first seedlings. Not tomatoes yet. Those she was starting indoors in the deep windowsill of the housekeeper's room, coaxing them against the odds the way she coaxed most things. But onions were already showing, kitchen sage. A small sturdy row of something green and hopeful that Presley had asked about, and she'd told him was parsley, and he'd looked at it like it was a novelty. Silas walked to the barn and back every morning now. Some mornings he walked out to the first pasture fence line. He came back from these walks looking tired in the good way, the way people look tired when they've spent their energy on something real. Dr. Aldrin came one last time in March and listened to the old man's lungs and told Abigail, with the direct collegial manner he'd been using with her since the conversation about Franklin's papers, that the lungs were clear, completely clear. He stood in the kitchen afterward and drank the coffee she poured him and said, I've been a physician for 30 years. What you did here in January was—" He stopped. He was not a man given to elaboration. "Good work," he said. She had held that in the quiet of the housekeeper's room that night and let it mean what it meant. Good work. Plain words. The right ones. In the first week of April, a letter arrived from Denver. It was from a woman she'd known there, the wife of a physician colleague of Franklin's, someone who had been kind in the careful, distant way of people who don't know how to be close to grief but want to do something. The letter asked how she was, offered news from Denver, and mentioned in a final paragraph that tried to be casual and wasn't quite, that there was a position available at the Denver hospital, working with the nursing staff, if she was interested. She sat with the letter for 2 days. On the third day, she put it in the drawer of the desk in the housekeeper's room, and she went downstairs and started the morning fire and began the breakfast. And when Silas came down, she had his coffee ready, and the kitchen was warm, and the seedlings on the windowsill were doing what seedlings do in April, which is mostly the private invisible work of becoming. She did not tell him about the letter. There was nothing to tell, really. She had made her decision before she read past the first paragraph, and she had just needed 2 days to make sure she was making it for the right reasons. She was staying because she wanted to, because this kitchen was hers now in the way that mattered, not by deed or payment, but by the particular ownership that comes from caring deeply for a place and the people in it and doing that work well. Because there were tomato seedlings on those windows that needed the whole summer to find out if they were going to work out. And she had decided she wanted to be there when they did or didn't. Because the Blackstone Ranch had needed someone who wouldn't leave when the leaving was easy. And she was, as it turned out, that person. She had come here with a travel bag and a dead husband's knowledge and the stubborn, unremarkable conviction that what she knew was worth something, that who she was underneath the body that the world kept misjudging was worth the trouble of insisting upon. She had been right. Not because the world had finally agreed with her. The world was slow at that, and partial, and could change its mind again tomorrow. But because she had done the work, and the work had held. And the proof of it was in the man at the kitchen table drinking his coffee and looking at the spring morning with the eyes of someone glad to be looking at it. That was enough, more than enough. It was, in the end, everything.